Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Darkveil. Tonight, we're uncovering 12 of the most disturbing true trucker horror stories ever submitted to this channel. These accounts come from long-haul truck drivers, dispatchers, truck stop employees, and overnight freight haulers who have spent countless nights on America's most isolated highways. Not campfire inventions, but first-hand experiences they've never been able to explain. The details are too specific, too consistent, and too unsettling to dismiss. Whenever possible, the locations, timelines, and circumstances behind these stories have been cross-checked against dispatch logs, highway records, accident reports, and local documentation connected to the routes involved. Before this night is over, you'll hear about a hitchhiker who disappeared before the next exit, a way station that vanished without a trace, and a voice on Channel 19 that knew something only a dead trucker should have known. If you enjoy slow-burning, authentic horror over cheap jump scares, subscribe, turn on the bell, and join us for every new upload. And if you've ever experienced something you still can't explain out on the road, share it in the comments. Your story may be the next one we uncover. Now, kill your dome light, keep both hands on the wheel, and let's begin. Anyone who's run I-10 through West Texas knows the drill. You're doing 70 through nothing but creosote bush and mesa for 200 miles at a stretch. And then out of nowhere, there's a sign telling you, all trucks must exit for weighing, mandatory, next half mile. I've pulled into every station on that corridor, more times than I could count, in 11 years of hauling general freight on that route. I knew every one of them by the smell of the diesel in the lot and the exact angle the ramp cut off the highway. I did not know the one about 6 miles past the Kent exit. In 11 years, it had never been there. That night, I was running solo, empty westbound, after a drop in San Antonio, dead heading out to pick up a load in El Paso. Nobody in the cab but me, and about 40 miles of nothing behind me and 40 more ahead. The sign came up out of the dark, like it had always been sitting there waiting on me, reflective letters catching my headlights the second, before I'd have blown right past it. I did what 11 years of habit tells you to do. I signaled. I slowed. I took the ramp. The scale house had its lights on. And there were a couple of trucks idling ahead of me, already in line, engines running, nobody visible in the cabs that I could make out. That struck me as strange even then, before anything else about that night had a chance to strike me as strange, because I hadn't passed a single truck going the other direction for the better part of 40 miles. On a corridor like that, you clock every headlight coming at you out of habit, the same way you clock every mile marker. There hadn't been any. The inspector who came to my window was polite enough, professional, clipboard, and a flashlight, asked for my logbook, my bill of lading, my CDL, all the usual. I handed it over without thinking twice. Then he asked me what year it was. I laughed, figured he was breaking up the boredom of a night shift, and I told him. He wrote it down on his clipboard like it was information he genuinely didn't already have, the way you'd write down somebody's weight, or their DOT number, not the way you'd write down a joke somebody just made. Then he asked if I knew the driver behind me. I told him nobody was behind me, that I hadn't seen a set of headlights in my mirror the whole time I'd been sitting in that line. He nodded slowly, the way you'd nod at a piece of information that confirmed something you already suspected, and told me to pull around to the scale. Whole thing took maybe 15 minutes by my own count. He handed me a citation slip through the window, folded once, and waved me back onto the highway. I didn't think much more about it until I hit a rest area outside Van Horn an hour later and pulled that slip out under a real light to see what I'd been written up for. The paper in my hand was blank, not faded, not smudged. Blank the way a piece of paper is blank before anybody's ever touched it with a pen. I sat there in the cab a good while, turning it over in the light, like I could will the ink back into existence, then folded it up and stuck it behind my visor. Mostly because I didn't know what else to do with a piece of paper like that. For a few weeks, I told myself it was fatigue, a bad batch of energy drinks, a scale house printer that ran dry at exactly the wrong moment. Trucking will make you doubt your own eyes plenty of times without any of it meaning anything. But 6 weeks later, I ran that same stretch again in daylight, same load type, same time of month, and I was watching for that exactly, so I wouldn't miss it a second time. There was no ramp, no scale house, just a stretch of cracked frontage road grown over with brush, a chain-link fence collapsed at one corner, and a rusted sign, barely legible, stating the facility had been decommissioned in 1994. I sat idling on the shoulder a long time trying to make that fence line match up against what I remembered from 6 weeks earlier, and it never once did. 1994 wasn't just a while ago to me. It was 3 years before I even had my learner's permit, let alone a CDL. Whatever I'd pulled into, it hadn't been operating in my lifetime as a driver, and, by the state's own sign, it hadn't been operating at all. I want to tell you I let it go after that. I didn't. What I did instead was pull my own ELD data off the company portal, the electronic log every truck's required to keep now, the one that's supposed to be more honest than any driver's memory because it doesn't get tired and it doesn't imagine things. According to my own count, I'd sat in that line and gotten checked in about 15 minutes. According to the log, generated automatically off the truck's own computer, I'd been stationary at that GPS coordinate for 2 hours and 10 minutes. Not 15. 2 hours and change, sitting still on a stretch of highway shoulder that, as far as the map function on that same log was concerned, didn't correspond to any listed facility at all, just a blank stretch of road with a pin dropped on it. My own memory had shorted itself by nearly 2 hours, and I hadn't felt a minute of it missing. That was the part that got me asking around, because a blank piece of paper is one thing, a rest stop story you can tell yourself in a dozen boring ways. Missing time verified by your own truck's black box is a different animal. I started bringing it up carefully at truck stops along that same corridor, over coffee. Never leading with the whole story, just fishing. Asking guys if they'd ever run into a way station past Kent that wasn't supposed to be there. Most guys just looked at me funny and said no, but 3 separate times, spread out over about 4 months, I got a different reaction. A guy would go quiet, set his coffee down, and ask me which mile marker, exactly, before I'd even finished the sentence. One of them was an older fellow who'd been driving since the early 80s. Said he'd pulled into it once in a truck that didn't even have a working air conditioner, decades before ELDs were ever required. Another was maybe 30. Said his GPS unit had glitched the whole time he sat in that line, screen just holding steady on a single frozen coordinate, like it had stopped updating. Different decades, different trucks, different technology entirely. Same 6 miles past Kent. The one who stuck with me most was a guy named Denny, ran for a different outfit out of Odessa, gray in the beard. The kind of driver who's seen enough on the road that nothing much rattles him anymore. I told him my story over a truck stop dinner, and instead of looking surprised, He just reached into his own logbook binder and pulled out a citation slip of his own, folded so many times over so many years. It had gone soft as cloth at the creases, blank, the same way mine was. What he told me next is the part I still think about most. He said that was his third one. Not his first time through that station, his third. Different years, different loads, same result every time. Same blank slip added to a little stack he kept in a cigar box at home. He said he'd stopped trying to make sense of why and started treating it like something that happened to him, periodically, the way a man might treat a recurring health scare he's learned to live around without ever getting a real diagnosis for it. That was the first time it occurred to me that whatever this was, it might not be a one-time thing that had happened to me. It might be something that comes back around. That thought sat badly enough with me that I started digging somewhere more official than truck stop conversation. I filed a public records request with the Texas Department of Transportation, mostly expecting a form letter and a shrug. What came back, weeks later, was a scanned decommissioning report from 1994, citing budget consolidation as the official reason for closing that station. Standard bureaucratic language, nothing you'd look at twice. But buried in an appendix, referenced almost in passing, was a note about a cluster of unresolved missing persons reports involving commercial drivers on that stretch of highway in the years leading up to the closure, and a line stating that reporting anomalies at the facility had been referred to an internal review that, as far as the document showed, never produced a public conclusion. Nobody had ever connected those disappearances to me on the news or in any official capacity. It was just sitting there, 3 sentences, deep in a document nobody outside a records office was ever supposed to read closely, telling me that whatever had gone on at that station before it closed, drivers going missing had been part of it. I brought all of this to my dispatcher eventually, half expecting to get laughed off the phone. Instead, I got a long pause, and then, off the record, an admission that the routings software our company used had carried a soft restriction on that exact segment for years. A note that just said, "Avoid after dark, when alone," no explanation attached to it. The kind of thing dispatchers follow without asking, because it's always just been there in the system. She told me a couple of drivers years back had brought up something similar and then, not long after, transferred to regional runs that never touched that corridor again, or quit driving altogether. Nobody at the company had ever officially called it anything. They'd just quietly built the routing around it and let the explanation die out with whoever used to know it. What finally cracked something open in me wasn't any of that, though. It was my own paperwork. I went back through my fuel card receipts from that same night, mostly out of habit, cross-checking mileage for a tax question that had nothing to do with any of this. And there it was, printed in the same faint dot matrix ink as every other receipt I'd ever gotten off that card. A fuel purchase at a travel center almost 70 miles further down the interstate, time-stamped for a window that overlapped, almost to the minute, with the 2 hours and 10 minutes my own ELD said I'd been sitting stationary at that phantom scale. My own card, my own signature, scrawled across the bottom, proving by the company's own records that I had been in 2 places on that highway at once. Other people's stories are one thing. Your own name on a receipt is another. By that point, I didn't want to go back, but I also couldn't leave it sitting the way it was, so I did something I still can't fully account for the reasoning behind. I waited for conditions to line up close to that first night, same load type, same time of month, running alone after dark, and I drove that stretch. A third time on purpose, watching for the sign instead of dreading it. It came up right where it always had, 6 miles past Kent, same reflective letters, same lit-up scale house. This time, when the inspector came to my window, I didn't hand my paperwork over quietly. I asked him straight out what the station was actually checking for. Why he'd asked me the year the first time. Why he'd wanted to know about a driver behind me who hadn't existed. He didn't act surprised by the question, which somehow got to me more than if he had. He told me not everybody who stops dead there is being checked for weight, that some are being checked for something else entirely, and that the paperwork for it just doesn't have an ordinary word yet. He said, "Everybody who runs a road long enough eventually comes through here, nigh sooner or later, that the mileage catches up with a person one way or another, that it wasn't personal." I asked him if I'd passed. He said that wasn't something that got decided at his window. I still carry both citation slips behind my visor now, mine, and for a while, a photograph Denny sent me of his 3. I hadn't looked at mine under anything but ordinary light in all that time, until one night, parked at a rest box stop. I was digging through my glove box for a tire gauge, and my hand landed on the little UV flashlight. I keep checking for checks at reflective tape and running my paper checks for watermarks before I'll accept one from a broker. I don't know. I don't know what made me point it at that folded slip instead of putting it away. Under that light, the paper wasn't blank at all. There was writing on it, plain and legible, in a font that didn't look handwritten and didn't look printed either, just present, the way text sits on a screen. It was a date. I checked it against my phone out of instinct, certain it would be some date back in that first year, some proof I could finally hold on to. It wasn't. It was that day's date, the actual day I was sitting in that rest stop parking lot checking it. I've looked at it under that same light a handful of times, since on different days, months apart, and it has never once shown me anything but whatever day it happens to be when I'm looking. I don't run that stretch after dark alone anymore if I can help it, and if I can't help it, I keep a second driver's number pulled up on my phone before I ever get near Kent, just so there's a real verifiable headlight behind me the whole way through. I've told this story to enough guys at enough truck stops now to know I'm not the only one carrying a folded blank slip of paper behind a visor somewhere on this stretch of highway, and I've stopped expecting anybody to hand me an explanation that makes it sit easier. What I've learned, the only thing I've really learned out of all of it, is simple enough to hold on to even at 3 in the morning with 200 miles of nothing on either side of me. If a sign for a way station shows up somewhere I don't remember one being, I find the nearest exit that isn't it, and I take it, mandatory or not. I run solo, but every couple of weeks I swap with a guy named Danny out of our Fort Worth yard, just so neither of us pulls more hours than we're supposed to on the same lanes week after week. This run was mine by myself, start to finish. A mixed produce load out of the valley, melons and onions mostly, headed up through San Antonio, north on 35 toward Dallas, then cutting over toward Oklahoma City. 3 days, maybe a little less if the way station stayed open, and I didn't hit construction around Waco. First time I noticed him was a rest stop, just outside New Braunfels, still early in the run. Older gray Freightliner, doors wiped clean of any company name, which by itself doesn't mean anything. Half the owner-operators running this corridor haul blank. What caught me was the plate. Dealer paper tag, the kind you're only supposed to run for 30 days. After you buy a truck, taped up crooked inside the back window, angled just enough that you couldn't get a clean read on it even standing right behind him. I clocked it, filed it away the way you file away anything a little off, and got back on the road. I didn't think about it again until Waco, a Buc-ee's about 4 hours later. Same gray Freightliner, same crooked paper tag, parked 3 pumps down. I've hauled long enough that I notice trucks the way some people notice faces. The scuff low on his bumper, the missing mud flap on the passenger side, both matched exactly. While I was fueling, I did something I don't usually bother with. I pulled my phone out and snapped a photo of the tag. Just habit from filling out too many incident reports over the years. The kind where they always ask if you documented anything. There was a guy hanging around the island next to mine, too. Phone up. And I figured he was one of those truck spotter types who photograph rigs for fun. I didn't think twice about it. I should have. That night, parked at a lot outside Dallas, taking my 10 hours, I was killing time before I fell asleep, and I zoomed into that photo of the tag. The date printed on it wasn't recent. It wasn't even close. Whoever bought that truck had bought it almost 2 months before, which meant somebody wasn't running an expired tag by accident. A 30-day paper only stays legal that long because it's meant to get replaced with a real plate fast. Somebody was choosing to keep driving around unidentifiable. That sat wrong with me in a way the truck itself hadn't. I pulled out the next morning after my reset, and 2 exits later, there he was in my mirror. Not tailgating. Tailgating I could have understood. Some idiot in a hurry. This was worse in a quieter way. He held the same gap every time I checked, close enough to 6 car lengths that I started counting on purpose. And it didn't matter if I was doing 45 through 70 on the open stretch past Gainesville. On the straight past Gainesville. A tail that holds distance like that isn't drifting behind you. It's pacing you. I got on the CB and threw a call out on 19 General, asking if anybody running behind a gray Freightliner with a paper tag wanted to talk. Nothing came back. Not even the usual static and crosstalk you get when the channel's just quiet. This was the specific kind of nothing you get when somebody's listening and decides not to answer. On a road that busy, that silence told me more than words would have. I called Danny that afternoon, mostly just to hear another voice, tell him what I was seeing and get told I was being paranoid. He didn't tell me that. He went quiet on the line for a second, and then he said 2 runs back. Same corridor. He'd had a gray truck sit behind him for the better part of an afternoon before it peeled off at an exit he never found a reason for. He hadn't mentioned it because nothing came of it, and he figured it wasn't worth the story. Hearing that changed the whole shape of what I was dealing with. This wasn't about me. It was about the lane. Danny kept talking, and he told me something he'd heard from another driver a few months back. A guy who'd stopped for the night at a lot. Off this same stretch, done everything right. Backed into a spot under a light. And woke up to find his trailer doors resealed with a seal that wasn't his. Whoever cut the original lock had taken half the load and closed it back up clean enough that if he hadn't counted pallets at the next stop, he might not have caught it before delivery. Produce moves fast on the side market, and nobody asks where it came from. That was the first time the word theft actually formed in my head, instead of just something creepy happening to me personally. I called our safety line next and gave them everything. The tag, the gap, the CB silence, what Danny told me. The woman on the line took it seriously enough that she put me on with someone else. And that person mentioned they'd had a couple other calls about a similar truck on that stretch recently, but with one detail that stuck with me harder than anything so far. The other reports hadn't come from pickup points. They'd come from closer to delivery. Whatever this was, It wasn't picking targets at random along the highway. It was following loads toward where they were headed. That got me thinking about who actually knew where I was headed. I pulled up my rate confirmation on my phone right there in the cab and looked at it like I'd never seen it before. Who booked it? How many hands it might have passed through before it landed on my dash? I couldn't prove anything sitting there. But I understood for the first time that whoever was behind me might not be guessing my route. They might have it in writing. I still had a full day of driving left, so I called ahead to the receiver in Oklahoma City that evening, earlier than I normally would, mostly just to confirm my appointment window and settle my own nerves. The woman on the phone said that was funny. Somebody had already called that morning trying to move my delivery to a different dock number. Said they were with my company. She gave me a name. It wasn't anybody who worked for us. It wasn't anybody I'd ever heard of. I hung up and called our actual dispatch straight after, half hoping they'd tell me it was a mix-up on our end. A new hire. A name I didn't recognize yet. They told me nobody from our office had made any call to that receiver that day. Whoever it was had my pickup, my load, my delivery window, and enough nerve to call ahead and try to walk the freight out from under me before I ever got there. That's when the guy at the Buc-ee's fuel island came back to me, the one with his phone up that I'd waved off as a truck spotter. I hadn't thought about what he was actually photographing. Not the truck. My trailer doors, my DOT number, the seal, everything you'd need if you wanted to walk up to a receiving dock somewhere down the line and sound exactly like you belonged there. By the third day, coming up on the Red River, I wasn't telling myself any of this was nothing anymore. I pulled into a Pilot outside Ardmore, parked under the brightest light in the lot, doors locked, engine running, and watched my mirror. He rolled past the exit without slowing down, back onto the interstate at a normal speed, like a truck that had never once sat 6 lengths off my bumper for 240 miles. Part of me wanted to read that as the end of it. It didn't feel like relief watching him go, though. It felt more like somebody deciding the play wasn't going to work this way and folding it for now, not folding it for good. So instead of letting my guard down, I called the receiver back and asked them to hold my delivery to a strict process. Nobody releases anything off that trailer without my ID and a callback to my actual dispatch. No exceptions, no matter what name gets dropped at the gate. They agreed easy enough once I explained why. And that's the moment I actually started breathing normal again, because for the first time in 3 days I'd done something instead of just watching. I rolled into the yard in Oklahoma City a little after 2 that afternoon, and there was a truck already sitting at the gate ahead of me, driver talking to the guard, paperwork in hand. A PO number close enough to mine that a tired guard on a normal day might have waved him through without a second look. This guard wasn't having a normal day because I'd called ahead and told them exactly what to watch for. He asked for ID. The other driver didn't have one that matched what was on the paperwork he was holding. And things got loud fast and then quiet. And then that truck was gone before I'd even backed up to my own door. Somebody called it in. I don't know everything that happened after that, only that a police report got filed on their end, same as mine, and for the first time, the whole thing stopped being a feeling and became something with an actual body attached to it, a real man standing at a real gate trying to walk off with a load that wasn't his. What came out over the following weeks, piece by piece, from a call with our safety office and one from a Texas trooper following up on my original report, was that the leak wasn't some hacker or anything that dramatic. It traced back to somebody who used to work load coordination for the broker who'd booked my run, laid off months earlier, who'd apparently kept access to booking details longer than anybody realized before somebody finally caught it and shut it down. No mastermind, no dramatic reveal. Just a gap in a system nobody had checked, sitting open long enough for somebody to walk through it more than once. The trooper also told me that gray Freightliner, or one just like it, had turned up weeks later on a completely unrelated traffic stop. Pulled over for that same expired paper tag. Papered, the thing that started this whole thing for me in the first place. 2 men in it. No proven connection yet to what happened at my gate, but enough overlap in the description that it went into the same file. Small thing. A traffic stop, not a standoff. That's usually how these things actually end. Quiet and administrative, not with anybody getting caught in some dramatic way. The part that stuck with me longest, though, came almost as an afterthought on that same call. Danny took the Valley Run himself the week after mine. Same corridor, same kind of load. He never clocked a truck behind him the whole trip. His trailer got hit anyway. Parked overnight at a lot outside Gainesville, doors cut and resealed, just like the story he'd told me. Half his load gone before he ever woke up. He hadn't seen anything to warn him, because there was nothing obvious to see that time. I had 3 days of a truck sitting exactly 6 lengths off my bumper to make me paranoid enough to start making calls. He just had a normal night that wasn't. I still keep my CB on 19, no matter how quiet it gets out there, and I still watch my mirror longer than I used to at every stop I make. If I ever clock the same truck behind me twice in one day again, I'm not waiting around for a third time to decide what it means. I've run bread and dry goods between Waco and Fairfield for going on 21 years now. Same 3 times a week loop. And when you drive a stretch of road that long, you quit needing your eyes for it. Your body just knows where the turns come, where the shoulder narrows down past the creek, where the fog sits low in that bottomland no matter what month it is. Somewhere in my first year or second, an old-timer named Curtis rode a run with me when my regular partner was out sick, and somewhere past Grosbeck, without any build-up to it, he told me about the girl at mile marker 47. He said it the way you'd tell a new man to watch for deer. Pass a certain fence line. Matter of fact. There's a girl who stands at 47 sometimes, he said, and if you see her, you keep driving. 16 maybe, in a pale dress that didn't match anything anybody wore anymore. His own daddy had run that road decades before him and seen the same girl, same age, same dress, 40 years apart. Like no time had touched her at all. Nobody Curtis knew had a name for her. The story going around then was that a family had gone off the shoulder there, sometime in the 50s, and she was the daughter. Still standing where it happened. Curtis told it like fact, and I believed him the way you believe an old-timer, without checking, because checking never once occurred to me. I saw her myself about 11 years in. Foggy morning, that low-ground fog that pools along the creek there and doesn't burn off till near 8. She was standing right at the marker, facing the road, hands folded in front of her like she was waiting on a bus that was never coming. I did what Curtis told me. Kept my eyes forward, kept my speed steady, didn't look at my mirror. My hands didn't stop shaking for 5 miles after. I saw her 3 more times over the years that followed. Always fog, always early, always that same spot. I never stopped. Some part of me always meant to, and some part of me never let the rest of me get there. Then this past spring, I hit a patch of black ice I never saw coming. Right at that stretch, and the trailer swung wide enough that I had to fight the wheel with everything I had to keep it off the shoulder. By the time I got the rig stopped and my heart back down out of my throat, she was standing not 30 feet from my door, closer than I'd ever let myself get in 20 years. I don't know what made me do it. 2 decades of not stopping, and that morning I put the truck in park. She didn't come any closer. She just looked at me, not scared, not angry, just tired, the way you look at somebody at the end of a long shift. And she said, or I heard, "I'm still not sure which. Tell them I made it home." Then the fog moved the way fog does, and she wasn't there. For a while after, I did what I imagine most men would do with a sentence like that. I carried it around and didn't know where to set it down. I still ran 84 3 times a week. I still slowed a little at 47 out of habit. And I took to saying, out loud, to nobody, I told them, even though I hadn't told anybody anything, because I didn't have a soul to tell it to. It felt like a lie every time I said it, but it felt worse not to say it at all. It might have stayed that way, a thing I carried and never set down, except for something that happened about 6 weeks later at a truck stop outside Mexia. I was sitting with my coffee, and I finally said it out loud to another driver, a fellow named Dale who'd run that same corridor about as long as I had. I told him about the ice and about her being close enough to touch and about what she'd said. I expected him to laugh it off or change the subject the way men do with things they don't know how to hold. Instead, he went quiet, turned his cup a half turn on the counter, and said that was close to what Curtis used to say too, near the end. I asked him what he meant, because, as far as I knew, Curtis had never told me a word past that first story. Dale said Curtis had gotten quieter about it in his last couple years. Wouldn't talk about 47 the way he used to, easy and offhand, like it was just something everybody ought to know. Said he'd started, saying he had something he needed to finish up out there before he was done driving. That sat wrong with me for days. I hadn't thought much about how Curtis died, if I'm honest. I'd filed it away years back, the way you file away news about a man you liked but hadn't kept up with. It came back to me slow, and not all at once, that it hadn't been his heart or his age that took him. He'd gone off 84 himself, alone in the cab, a few miles shy of where I'd always pictured him retiring to a porch somewhere. I'm not going to sit here and tell you those two things are tied together, because I don't know that they are, and a man who claims to know things like that is usually selling something. But it sat with me. It sat with me enough that for the first time in 21 years, I decided I wanted to know if any of what Curtis told me back at the start was even true. So on a Saturday I don't usually work, I drove into Grosbeck and went to the county library, thinking I'd find that old newspaper story about the family that went off the shoulder in the 50s. Get a name at last, maybe even a date I could carry out to the marker with me. I went through the indexes for every year in that decade I could think a family might have died on that stretch. There was nothing. No wreck, no obituary, no family matching anything close to what Curtis had described. Whatever story he'd been told, and whatever story he'd passed down to me like it was gospel, wasn't sitting in any county paper from that era. 21 years I'd been carrying a story that, as far as the record showed, never happened. I almost quit right there, I told myself. I'd chased a piece of folklore about a piece of folklore and come up with nothing, which is about what you'd expect. But the librarian, a younger woman who'd gotten curious about what I was hunting for, pulled a different box down while I was packing up. One from the 70s, she said, got asked after sometimes by people doing family history. I wasn't looking for the 70s. I almost didn't open it. But I did, And about halfway through, I found a short piece, 4 inches of column space, about a girl who'd gone missing, walking along 84 between Grosbeck and Mexia one evening in late 1979. 16 years old, last seen near dusk, never found. Case gone cold inside a year, the way they did back then when there wasn't a body and there wasn't a suspect anybody could make stick. Her name was Carla Jean Whitfield. I sat with that paper a long time. 16, not the girl of an old wreck, but a girl who'd walked out of her own life and never walked back into it. 20-some years after the decade Curtis always named. And near the bottom, quoting a family member, was a description of what she'd been wearing when she left the house that evening. A pale yellow dress, a hand-me-down, out of fashion even then. I'd heard that dress described to me by drivers who'd never read that article, who'd never have any reason to know it existed, going back further than I'd been running that road myself. Whatever had gotten twisted up in the telling over the years, the dress hadn't been invented. Somebody had actually seen it on her before whatever happened to her happened. I drove into Mexia the next weekend, not entirely sure what I was looking for, and ended up at a diner on the square asking an older woman behind the counter, careful with my words, if she remembered anything about a girl going missing back in '79. She didn't warm up to the question. Said the family never believed anything happened to that girl at all. Said the town talked at the time about a boy Carla Jean had been running with, older, not well thought of. And the family had always figured she'd run off with him and simply never had the decency to call home. 50 years, and what I heard in that woman's voice wasn't grief. It was old resentment, kept warm the way some families keep it warm on purpose. It took me another 2 weeks of asking around before somebody pointed me toward Carla Jean's younger brother, Roy, still living on a piece of land outside town. In his 60s now, gray and slow-moving when he opened his door to a stranger, with no good reason to be standing on his porch. I don't fully remember what I said to explain myself. I remember it came out clumsy. Something about running the road his sister disappeared on. Something about hearing things out there I couldn't explain, and didn't feel right keeping to myself. I expected him to shut the door. He didn't. He asked me in instead, and over coffee gone lukewarm. He told me his family had cut Carla Jean's name out of things for decades. Wouldn't say it at Christmas. Never added her to the front page of the family Bible when they updated it after his mother passed, said saying. Her name felt like handing her a forgiveness nobody in that house had agreed to give. I told him what she'd said to me at the marker, closer than I'd ever let anybody get before. Tell them I made it home. Roy didn't say much to that at first. Then he told me there was a man still living nearby, a retired deputy named Odell Rainey, who'd worked the county back in '79 and might remember things that never made it into any newspaper. Odell remembered plenty. Sitting on his own porch a few days later, he told me something Roy had never known, something that had never made it into any file the family ever saw. Back in the mid-'80s, 5-6 years after Carla Jean went missing, a body had come up out of the creek bottom near mile marker 47 during a flood. No identification on her, no missing persons report anybody thought to check against, because by then, the town had already settled into the story that Carla Jean Whitfield had run off with a boy and made her own choice not to come back. She went into the ground as a Jane Doe in the county's unmarked section, and nobody ever connected the two, because nobody was looking to connect them. She'd been half a mile from where her own brother grew up the whole time, under a stone with no name on it, while her family carried resentment instead of grief for the better part of 40 years. Getting anything done about it after that took weeks, not days, the way these things actually go. Roy and I went together to the county and eventually to a state lab, asking what could still be compared this far out. There was old paperwork to track down, a dental record from a school office that hadn't been thrown out, a cousin willing to give a sample for comparison. Nobody promised us anything. We waited through most of a summer not knowing, which was its own kind of hard, harder in some ways than not knowing at all, because now there was a real answer sitting somewhere in a lab, and we just didn't have it yet. When the call finally came, it was Roy who told me, not the other way around. It was her, 40-some years unmarked, and she had her name back on paper. They buried her properly that fall, a small service, family, only mostly, though Roy asked me to stand at the back of it, which I did, feeling like I didn't belong there, and knowing I wouldn't have missed it for anything. There's a real headstone out there now, with Carla Jean Whitfield cut into it, dates and all. Roy shook my hand after and told me it wasn't the road that had been holding on to his sister all those years. It was his own family, refusing to say her name, refusing to grieve her because they'd decided, without ever checking, that she didn't deserve it. I kept running 84 after that, same 3 days a week, and I watched for her out of an old habit I couldn't quite let go of. I didn't see her, not that fall, not that winter. I figured that with that, and some mornings driving past 47, I'd feel something close to relief and something close to loss in the same breath, which is a strange combination to sit with at 5 in the morning with a full trailer behind you. Then this past January, fog thick along the bottomland the way it gets that time of year, I did see somebody standing at the marker. My chest went tight before I even had time to think about it. But it wasn't a girl in a pale dress. It was an older woman, standing still, facing the creek instead of the road. I didn't stop that morning either, old habits being what they are, but I mentioned it to Roy the next time I saw him, careful about how I said it. He wasn't surprised. Said that would have been Wanda, Carla Jean's older sister, who'd taken up driving out early some mornings, just to stand where her sister had been found. Now that there was finally a place to stand and a name to say out loud when she got there. I still run that road 3 times a week, same as I have for 21 years, and I still slow down a little at mile marker 47, same as I always did. But when I say it now, out loud, to nobody, I told them, it isn't a lie anymore. I know exactly who I told, and I know exactly what it cost to be able to say it true. Some nights I think that's the only kind of ghost story worth telling. The kind where the haunting was never really about the dead at all. It was about the living, refusing for 40 years to say one girl's name, until somebody finally did. There's a kind of load you take without asking questions. And if you run security freight long enough, you learn not to want the answers anyway. This one came through a broker I'd worked with maybe 4 times before, decent pay, short notice, pickup at a rail transload yard in San Antonio, drop at a fenced lot off the interstate outside Sonora. Trailer was already loaded and sealed when I hooked to it. DOT tamper seal, number logged on the bill of lading, and a note from dispatch that I still have a photo of on my phone. Seal stays intact. Do not open for any reason. Confirm seal number at drop, not before. I've hauled sealed freight plenty of times. Government stuff, pharma, electronics. Nobody once opened roadside. This one felt different almost immediately. And I want to be honest that I can't tell you exactly why, except that the weight was wrong. I checked my scale ticket twice, because the number didn't match what I felt in the cab. Loaded weight said one thing. The way the trailer handled said another. lighter than it should have been for the tonnage on paper. Then I took a curve too fast outside Junction and felt something shift. Not slide, shift, like weight moving itself rather than weight being thrown. For about 2 seconds, the trailer handled like it was fully loaded again before it evened back out. I've pulled livestock trailers before, years back, and there's a specific feel to a load that can move on its own, brace itself, lean into a turn the way a dry box of crated parts never will. I didn't want to think that's what this was, because the paperwork said general freight, palletized, no special handling required. But some part of my hands on the wheel already knew better than my head did. It happened 3 more times over that drive. Always on a turn, never on a straightaway, never at the same intensity twice. Somewhere past Sonora city limits, running slow through a diamond interchange, my vents pulled a smell forward from the trailer that had no business being there. Not diesel, not the ozone smell of an overheating axle. Something wet and animal, like a barn on a humid morning. And under the road noise, for maybe 3 seconds, I heard something that wasn't wind and wasn't tire hum. I'm not going to tell you what it sounded like, because every time I've tried to describe it to somebody else, I talk myself into believing I imagined it, and I'd rather leave it where it is. I'll just say it didn't sound like metal, and it didn't sound like nothing. I made the drop at the fenced lot a little after midnight. No signage, no company name, just a gate, a guard in a booth who checked my seal number against a clipboard without a word, and 2 men who unhooked the trailer fast, faster than any drop I'd done before. While they were swinging it back toward a low building behind the fence, my headlights caught the edge of what was past the gate for maybe 2 seconds before someone waved me forward to get my paperwork signed. Rows of chain link runs, low-roofed, the kind you'd use for kennels except too big for dogs, and somewhere back in the dark of one of them, a pair of eyes caught the light and held it a beat too long before the beam swept past. Not cattle. Not anything I'd have expected on a fenced lot off I-10 outside a town that size. I asked the guard, because I couldn't not, what was in the trailer. He didn't answer. Didn't act annoyed, didn't act cagey, just genuinely didn't respond at all. Like the question hadn't reached him. I got paid on time. Full rate, no questions from the broker either way. I took 2 more loads through him after that. Ordinary stuff. Nothing sealed, and I told myself I was done thinking about it. I wasn't. 3 weeks later, sitting in a truck stop outside Ozona, waiting on a reset, I finally did what I'd been telling myself not to do, and looked up whatever I could find about that stretch of road outside Sonora. Most of it was nothing. Ranch listings, county commissioner minutes, a piece about a water district dispute. But buried in the archive of the county paper was 4 paragraphs from that same week about a property outside town getting visited by state wildlife wardens on what the article called a compliance inspection tied to an ongoing investigation. No arrests named, no address given beyond a ranch property off the interstate. I read it maybe 6 times. It didn't confirm anything I could point to, but it put a word to the unease I'd been carrying since that midnight drop, and the word was wardens. Not sheriffs, not DEA. Wildlife. I let it sit after that. Told myself a compliance visit could mean 50 boring things. Permit paperwork, fencing height, nothing that touched me. Then in October, almost 4 months after the run, I got a call from a number I didn't know. A woman who identified herself as a special agent working a joint case with a state game warden's office. And she had my name off a dispatch log the broker had turned over under subpoena. She wasn't interested in me for anything I'd done wrong. She said that plainly and early, more than once. like she expected me to be scared and wanted to get past it fast. She just wanted to ask about one run, back in July, pick up at the San Antonio rail yard, drop outside Sonora. She already had the seal number. She already had my ELD data pulled up on her end before I'd said a word. I told her everything I've told you. The weight, the smell, the sound I still won't describe. The eyes in the dark past the fence. She didn't seem surprised by any of it, which was its own kind of answer. What she told me back, over about 20 minutes on the phone, reshaped the whole thing for me. The lot outside Sonora wasn't a ranch in any normal sense. It was a private holding operation, one stop in a chain that moved animals, protected and endangered species, some legally owned under old permits, some not owned legally at all, between breeders and private collectors across 3 states, using sealed freight and drivers, who never opened a trailer and never asked, because the seal did the work of a wall. Mine wasn't the only name in that dispatch log. There'd been other drivers, other runs, going back years. Every one of them told the same thing dispatch told me. Don't open it. Confirm the number at drop, not before. What finally got the case moving, she said, wasn't a tip about the ranch or the broker. It was a microchip scan. When the animals recovered from that lot went through processing at a wildlife rescue facility, one of them, a cat, came back at the scanner with an implant history that had been logged and relogged at 3 different facilities over 5 years, meaning it had made this kind of move. Crate, trailer, sealed run, unload behind a fence. More times than anyone could account for cleanly. It wasn't young. It had done this before. Plenty of times before. I didn't say anything for a while after she told me that. She let the quiet sit, which I appreciated, because I needed it. I was thinking about the shift on the turns outside Junction, that 2 seconds of the trailer handling like it was fully loaded, evening back out, and I understood, finally, that wasn't cargo settling. That was something that had learned over years of exactly this kind of drive, when a truck was about to lean, and had braced for it out of habit, the way you'd brace on a bus you'd ridden 100 times. It hadn't been afraid of the turns anymore. It had just known them. I gave my statement. I'm not a target, she told me twice, and I believe her, though I still felt the need to hear it twice. The case is still open as far as I know, and I haven't heard whether anyone's been charged. And I've stopped checking, because checking doesn't change what I carry out of it. I haven't taken a sealed load since, and if the broker calls with one, I already know what I'll say. It's not about the money, though I've thought plenty about the money too, since drivers don't always get to be picky. It's that I keep landing back on that trailer outside Junction, that 2 seconds of weight coming alive under me and settling again, and I can't unknow what I know now about why it moved the way it did. Whatever was in that trailer knew the road better than I did. Turns out, it had good reason to. Every trucker's heard some version of this one, so I'll tell you mine the way it was told to me first, by a guy named Ray at a truck stop outside Huntsville, maybe 15 years ago. And then I'll tell you what happened after. Not just to me. What happened after? Ray said there's a voice on Channel 19, not always. Not for everybody. But every long hauler eventually hears it once, if they run enough miles. It sounds exactly like your dispatcher, not similar. Exactly. Same cadence. Same way they say your handle. Sometimes referencing something true. Something only your actual dispatcher would know. Like a delivery number or a customer's name. And the voice gives you a detour. Take the next exit, it says. Construction ahead. Follow the service road. We'll route you back at the next junction. The trick of it, Ray said, is that it's always plausible. Never a request that sounds crazy. Just wrong. In a way you don't figure out until you're already 3 miles down a farm road that shouldn't dead end and does. Ray said, the rule everybody passes down is this. If you weren't already talking to your dispatcher and the voice just comes on and greets you by your handle, first, you don't answer. You call your dispatcher on the phone, not the radio, and you confirm before you take a single instruction. He said he'd heard from 3 different guys who followed the voice's detour and lost time they couldn't account for. Not missing hours exactly, just time that didn't add up right on the logbook afterward. A drive that should have taken 40 minutes, taking 2.5 hours, with nothing to show for the gap. I filed it away the way you file away any story a guy tells you at a truck stop at 11 at night. Until about 4 years ago, running that same stretch of 45 through the Pines, dead zone for cell service. Channel 19, mostly quiet the way it gets in there. A voice came on, said my handle before I'd said a word, told me there was a wreck ahead, take the next exit, follow the access road, they'd loop me back at the county line. It sounded exactly like my dispatcher, Rhonda. Same rasp in her voice from the 2 packs a day she won't quit. She even referenced a customer name I hadn't mentioned on the radio that day. I didn't answer. I don't fully know why. Ray's story maybe, sitting somewhere in the back of my head for a decade. I kept driving straight, watched for the exit she'd described, and there wasn't one. No access road, no construction, nothing but pine trees and mile markers ticking by normal as anything. I called Rhonda on my cell the second I had a bar of signal. She hadn't been on the radio all night. Hadn't said a word to me since my last check-in 2 hours before. That would have been the end of it. The kind of thing you tell at a truck stop yourself one day and let it become somebody else's Ray story. Except about 8 months later, I was sitting at a pilot outside Corsicana, and I brought it up to a couple guys over coffee, mostly to see if they'd heard the legend too. And one of them, older fella, pulling reefer for a produce outfit, got real quiet and said it hadn't happened to him, but it happened to his cousin, and asked what I was hauling that night. I told him, high-value electronics, temperature-controlled pharma overflow, the kind of freight that gets a security seal and a check call every 2 hours. He nodded, like that confirmed something, and said his cousin was hauling surgical supplies. Another driver at the table said the same thing had happened to a buddy of his hauling copper wire. Worth its weight some months. Nobody at that table who'd heard the voice, or knew somebody who was hauling scrap or empty trailers or anything. You couldn't move fast on a black market. That sat wrong with me for weeks. A ghost story doesn't usually care what's in your trailer. Then, this past March, I got a call, not on the radio, on my actual phone, from a driver named Denny Ochoa I'd known maybe 6 years, ran for a different carrier out of Dallas. He'd gone quiet for 4 days, which for Denny was strange enough that his dispatcher had called his wife, and his wife had called the highway patrol, and they found his tractor sitting off a gravel cutback south of Buffalo. Trailer doors standing open, load gone, Denny himself sitting against the back tire with his wrists zip-tied and a knot on his head, alive, scared out of his mind, but alive. When he could talk about it, he said the voice on 19 had told him his dispatcher's name, told him a PO number that matched his actual paperwork, and sent him down a road that looked like every other pine road in East Texas until it opened onto a clearing with a box truck and 3 men waiting who knew exactly which pallets they wanted before they even cracked his doors. That's the part that took the story out of the truck stop and put it somewhere else entirely for me. Because knowing your handle That's easy. That's painted on your truck or squawked over the radio 100 times a shift. But knowing a PO number, knowing a customer's name, knowing which 2 hours of the night, your specific dispatcher wasn't going to be listening close. That's not a ghost story detail. That's inventory. That's somebody with eyes inside a system. A DPS investigator who worked Denny's case, and by then 2 others like it that hadn't made the news, told a room of us at a carrier safety meeting that they believed whoever was running the detours had access to load matching software, the kind brokers and carriers both plug into, and possibly a compromised dispatch terminal somewhere upstream, because the level of detail didn't fit casual scanner traffic. Somebody wasn't guessing. Somebody was reading off a screen in close to real time and then keying a radio to sound like a voice that driver already trusted. The investigator didn't have a name. 4 years later, near as I know, they still don't. What I haven't told anybody outside this cab, and I'm only telling you because you're a stranger on the other end of a signal I'll lose in about 6 miles, is that the customer name the voice used on me that first night, the one I never said out loud on the radio, I called Rhonda about it again a few months back, long after I'd half convinced myself it was a coincidence I'd misremembered. She checked her own call log from that shift out of curiosity. That customer name existed exactly one place before it came out of that voice's mouth, in a note she'd typed into our dispatch software, 40 minutes before I ever heard my handle on Channel 19. A note nobody but her and whoever has eyes on that system was ever supposed to see. So I still run that stretch. I still keep 19 on, because turning it off doesn't make anybody safer. It just makes you deaf. And if a voice ever greets me by name before I've said a thing, real dispatcher or not, I hang back and I call the phone first, every single time. But I'll tell you the part Ray never had to tell me, the part I have to live with now that he didn't. It's not a ghost. Ghosts don't need your PO number. Somewhere out there, close enough to a keyboard to read what my dispatcher types the same night she types it, is somebody who's still listening. And far as I know, nobody's ever caught him. I took over Route 9 about 8 months back. It's a delivery circuit for a regional grocery distributor out of Nacogdoches, a loop through 6 little towns, strung along the back roads toward Jasper. Some of them so small the whole business district is a Baptist church, a feed store, and one grocery that doubles as the post office. Bread, dairy, dry goods. Same 6 stops, 3 mornings a week, rain or shine. And you learn the potholes on that road the way you learn the lines on your own hand. The route opened up because the driver before me didn't finish it. His name was Wallace. Nobody at the company would give me more than the bones of it, and I got the sense they'd rehearsed keeping it that way. Wallace made his first 4 stops on a Thursday morning like any other, right on schedule. Nothing in the delivery logs to suggest otherwise. Somewhere between the 4th stop and the 5th, a little grocery outside a town that doesn't even rate a stoplight, he stopped showing up. Not late, not behind schedule. Gone. The truck turned up at the 6th and final stop. Engine off, keys still in the ignition, doors unlocked, like he'd parked it and walked inside somewhere and just never come back out. Except he never made the 5th stop to begin with, so there was no earthly way that truck should have reached the 6th on its own. I didn't dwell on it. Trucking jobs open up for all kinds of reasons. Medical, personal. A man just deciding one morning he's done with driving a bread truck through the pines. This felt stranger than most, but I figured strange wasn't the same as sinister, and I needed the work. They gave me Wallace's truck. Not a truck like his truck, same VIN sticker on the doorframe, same coffee ring baked into the dash where a to-go cup had sat one time too many. When I cleaned it out that first week, I found his lunch still zipped in a soft-sided cooler behind the seat, gone green and hard in the Texas heat, and in the glove box under the registration, a house key on a plain ring and $11 in a rubber-banded roll that looked set aside for something specific, maybe a laundromat, maybe a kid's allowance. A man doesn't leave his lunch and his house key in a truck if he's planning on not going home. Whatever happened to Wallace, he didn't see it coming, and that sat with me longer than the company's silence did. The people on the route started acting strange around me pretty quick, though it took me a while to name what was strange about it. Not unfriendly. If anything, they were too gentle, too careful. Like they were handling something they'd already dropped once and didn't want to drop again. At my second stop, a little grocery run by a woman named Deb, she watched me carry in the milk crates and asked soft, like she already knew the answer might not be simple. "You the one who came back?" I laughed and told her I was new, hadn't been anywhere yet to come back from. She nodded slow, the way you nod at somebody when you've decided not to argue with them, and went back to her register. I figured it was a one-off, some local joke I wasn't in on. Then it happened at my fourth stop, a different woman, same careful tone, same question near enough, word for word. Then at the sixth, an old man stocking shelves asked it, without even looking up from what he was doing, like it was a formality, like he was checking a box. 3 different people, 3 different stops, and every one of them asked it the same way. Not making conversation, but waiting on an answer they already half expected, and my no didn't seem to land right with any of them. I finally pushed Deb on it on a slow Tuesday, told her straight out I wanted to know what she meant by it. She got quiet in a way that told me she'd been asked to explain this before and never liked doing it. Then she told me Wallace wasn't the first driver Route 9 had lost. There'd been at least 2 others before him, she said, going back further than she could account for, firsthand, spaced out over years, maybe a couple decades between each one. Always the same shape to it. Fine through the 4th stop. Gone by the 5th. Truck sitting at the 6th like it had driven itself there empty. And every time the company sent a new driver out to run the route, afterward, the first few weeks, folks along the stops would ask him that same question. Because, more than once, she said, dropping her voice. Like she still wasn't sure she should be telling me this. The new driver had looked back at her funny when she asked it. Like he was trying to remember something he wasn't sure had happened to him. That should have been the end of it for me. Filed away with ghost stories and things people tell each other in small towns to make the highway feel less empty. But I kept turning over one detail Deb said without meaning to make much of it. That the company knew. That this wasn't just something the route towns whispered about among themselves. It was something the distributor had quietly built into how they did business. So, I went looking more out of my own unease than anything, and asked our yard dispatcher, a woman who'd been filing routes for the company almost 30 years, whether Route 9 had always been called that. She hesitated, then told me it used to carry a different number entirely, and got renumbered sometime back in the 90s, around the same stretch of years. Best she could recall, that one of those earlier drivers had gone missing. Renumbering a route doesn't happen for nothing. I pulled my own hire paperwork out of the folder in my glove box that night, and found, buried in the boilerplate I'd signed, without reading close, a clause about operational risk specific to certain assigned circuits that no other route driver I asked had in their contract. The company hadn't just noticed the pattern. They'd built a legal cushion around it and kept sending drivers out anyway. For a couple months after that, I drove the route the same as always, but I started watching the clock between the fourth stop and the fifth, without really deciding to. Just a habit, I told myself. Then one Thursday in early spring, almost a year to the week after whatever happened to Wallace, I lived the reason for that habit myself. I left the fourth stop with a full cup of coffee still steaming in the cup holder and a country station on the radio, same as any other morning. I remember pulling out onto the county road. I remember the tree line starting to go from pine to that low scrubby brush before the fifth stop's turnoff. And then I was parking in the gravel lot at the fifth stop with the coffee gone stone cold in my hand and the radio playing a song I hadn't heard start. And the clock on the dash said 22 minutes had passed, that I could not account for even a little bit. 22 minutes on a stretch of road that takes 11. On a morning, I remembered clean up until it wasn't there to remember anymore. I didn't tell the company. I told Denny, a mechanic at the yard, who has access to the telematics box every truck carries now, the GPS unit that logs speed and stops for insurance purposes. I asked him, easy as I could manage, to pull my logs from that Thursday. What he found wasn't nothing, which was almost worse than if it had been. Between the fourth stop and the fifth, the unit showed the truck sitting stationary for 18 of those 22 minutes, at a set of coordinates half a mile off the county road. Down an old spur that doesn't appear on any current map of the route. Denny, not knowing what he was handing me, mentioned it was strange because he'd seen that same ping before, going back through the archived logs on that truck, years of them. Long before I ever sat behind that wheel. I drove out there on a Sunday, off the clock, told nobody where I was going. The spur road was barely a road anymore, more a memory of one, grown up in dewberry and young pine. But it took me to a clearing, with a house foundation gone soft at the edges, and a single porch chair still sitting upright on what used to be a slab, weathered but not fallen apart. Like something that got sat in more recently than the house around it would suggest. An old woman was working a garden plot a couple 100 yards off, and when she saw me standing there, she didn't call out a greeting. She called out a name. Not mine, or not the one I've gone by these last several years. She said it, like she was sure of it, like she'd said it to that same face before, and when I told her she had the wrong man, she looked at me a long moment and said, real quiet, that she supposed a person could forget himself if the forgetting was bad enough. I didn't sleep right for a week after that. What finally cracked it open wasn't anything Denny or Deb or that old woman told me. It was my own life, the part of it I'd never looked at, too hard, a stretch of about 4 months a good while back that I've always off as a rough patch. A blackout period I chalked up to drinking too much and a marriage falling apart. Months I genuinely cannot account for in any real detail, even now. When I lined that stretch up against the years Deb had given me for the second-to-last driver, Route 9 Lost, it fit close enough to stop my breath. I was never told his name. I never thought to ask if it might be mine. I still run Route 9. All 6 stops every time, on schedule. I still time myself between the 4th stop and the 5th, but not anymore, because I'm curious what would happen if it caught up to me. I keep the time because some part of me, the part that lost 4 months once and built a whole new life on top of the hole it left, is trying to remember exactly how long I had the first time, before I forget again that I'm the one who came back. I run reefer freight mostly, meat and produce, which means night runs more often than not because you want to hit the receiving docks before the heat of the day gets into your product, and some clerk starts taking temperature readings that cost you money. I was running US 287 between Wichita Falls and Amarillo, one of those stretches where the towns thin out to almost nothing, and the road runs straight enough that you can watch headlights behind you or yard smells before they ever catch up to your bumper. I noticed the truck behind me, somewhere past Vernon. Nothing strange about that by itself. Another truck holding your pace happens on every long run, especially at night, when there might be 5 or 6 of us total moving freight on this stretch, and we all bunch up around the same fuel stops and the same bad coffee. What got my attention was smaller than that. Every time I checked my mirror for an exit sign, my spotlight caught the plate on his front bumper, and something about the number sequence sat wrong in my head. Familiar in a way I couldn't place. The way a phone number feels familiar right before you realize it's your own. I didn't think much of it until we both slowed for a construction zone outside Childress, orange barrels squeezing 2 lanes into one, and a flagger walking a stop sign back and forth under generator lights. For about 4 seconds, our trucks ran close enough side by side that I could read his plate clean in my mirror instead of catching pieces of it. It was mine, not close, not similar, mine. Same state, same 6 characters, same DOT number stenciled under it, same company name on the door, the little outfit I leased to out of Amarillo. I actually turned and looked at my own door for a second, like I needed to confirm it was still mine, which it was, because of course it was. I got Denise, my dispatcher, on the phone the second I had a signal and asked her if we'd somehow double-plated a truck, some clerical screw-up at the DMV or the leasing company. She pulled it up while I was still talking, told me there was exactly 1 truck in the fleet running that plate and that DOT number, and I was sitting in it. I told her I knew that. That was the problem. There was another truck out here wearing it too. And she went quiet in a way that told me she didn't have a next sentence for that. I slowed down after we cleared the construction zone, figuring I'd let him pull ahead so I could get a longer look at the cab. He didn't pass me. He slowed with me, matched it almost to the mile marker, staying level instead of pulling ahead or dropping back. Like passing wasn't the point of whatever he was doing. I could make out a shape behind the wheel, ball cap, forearm on the door. But the tint and the distance kept me from a face. Then, without meaning to, I found the one detail that made my stomach actually drop instead of just my nerves. My driver's side mirror sits a little crooked, has since I clipped a dock support in Lubbock last winter, and the shop straightened the arm, but never quite got it dead level again. I've stared at that mirror every night for a year. His was tilted the same exact way. Not a similar lean. The same lean, like somebody had measured mine and copied it. I took the next exit into Childress, more to get off the road than because I needed anything there. He didn't follow. Kept going straight up 287 like nothing had happened. Taillights shrinking down to 2 more lights on a dark highway. I called DPS from the truck stop and gave the trooper what I had, the plate that was mine, the direction, the description, the mirror. He was polite about it, but I could hear him not knowing what box to put this in, a man reporting a truck for wearing his own plate. Before we hung up, he mentioned, almost like an afterthought, that they'd been getting a handful of calls that year about cloned commercial trucks running the 287 and 40 corridor, something to do with load board scams. And he'd pass my report along to whoever was tracking that. I said thanks and hung up, thinking that had nothing to do with what I'd just seen. because no scam artist copies a mirror off a random photo. I was wrong about how unrelated it was, but it would take me weeks to find that out. I checked with the company again the next morning, wide awake, coffee actually working this time. Nothing had changed. One truck, one plate, mine. I pulled the GPS log out of some need to see it written down, and there it was, a 2-minute gap right around Childress, where the unit apparently lost signal and picked back up mid-route. I almost let that go as a dead zone, until I thought to check the inward-facing dash cam for that same window, the one that's supposed to be recording me the whole time for insurance purposes. Same 2 minutes, no picture. Not frozen, not choppy, just gone, like the camera itself had been switched off and back on. That got the truck into the shop instead of just my head. The mechanic found it behind the dash, zip-tied to a wiring bundle, tapped into the same harness that feeds my ELD. Not a factory part, no branding he recognized. Wired in clean and fast by somebody who already knew exactly where that harness ran. He didn't have a good explanation either. Just told me whoever did it hadn't needed more than a couple minutes alone with the truck. I told the story to another driver at a pilot outside Vernon a few nights later, mostly to hear myself say it out loud and see if it still sounded as crazy as it felt. An older guy 2 stools down at the counter, somebody I only half knew from the fuel island, went quiet and set his fork down. Said a driver leased to the same outfit as me, years back before my time, had told him almost the identical story. His own rig running the wrong way outside Childress at night. Said about 3 weeks after that, the guy got pulled at a scale house, hauling something in his trailer. He swore up and down he never loaded, spent months and a lawyer clearing his name, and quit driving altogether once it was over. He said it flat, not trying to scare me, just telling me what he remembered, which somehow made it worse. That sent me back through my own paperwork instead of just my nerves. Cross-referencing bills of lading against fuel receipts, I found a seal number logged against my trailer for a date I could prove. Receipt in hand. I'd spent sitting at a truck stop in Post, waiting out a rest break. Weight didn't match anything I'd ever hauled that month. Somebody had used my number on paper for a load that never touched my truck. A broker I'd worked a handful of loads for called me not long after that, sounding annoyed more than anything, asking why I'd no-showed a pickup he had confirmed with me the week before, one I had never actually booked. Said my truck, plate and MC number both checked out on his end, had shown up at the shipper, picked up a partial load, and left. The shipper's own dock camera had it on file, a truck that looked exactly like mine rolling through the gate. After that load never got where it was supposed to go. An insurance investigator working cargo theft called me directly, and the first conversation was not a friendly one. On paper, every identifier pointed straight at me, my plate, my DOT number, my company name on the door. It took my actual toll records and fuel card charges, hundreds of miles away, on the day in question, plus that tampered device the shop had pulled out of my dash to get him to stop treating me like the suspect and start treating me like the mark. The bigger picture came out over the following weeks, and it wasn't personal in the way I'd been bracing for. A factoring company that handles paperwork for a bunch of small owner-operator outfits, mine included, had a data breach earlier that year. The kind that leaks MC numbers, insurance certificates, and the compliance photos every carrier has to file of their own trucks. Turned out better than a dozen small carriers along 40 and 287 got cloned. That same season, same method, same playbook. Trucks built to pass a visual check at a dock because somebody had a clear photo to copy from. It had never been about me specifically. I was just one name on a list that got sold to whoever was running the scheme. Knowing that didn't put much of it back together. My MC number still carries a flag from the investigation even though I was cleared. And a couple of brokers have gotten quiet on me since. The kind of quiet where they just stop calling instead of explaining why. Insurance went up. I still run 287 because it's still the run that pays, and I still check that stretch outside Childress every single time, mirror first, out of a habit I never asked for. A few months after all of it, on a clear night with nobody else on the road, I caught two headlights behind me again past Vernon, holding my pace the same patient way. I didn't wait for a construction zone this time. I slowed down deliberately until he had to either pass or match me, and he matched me. Same as before, same distance, same unhurried patience. When he finally eased up alongside long enough for my spotlight to catch his door, the name painted on it wasn't mine. Different company, different city, a name I'd never seen before in my life. I let off the gas and watched him pull ahead into the dark taillights, shrinking the same way the first ones had. And I understood, sitting there with my hands still tight on the wheel, that it had never really been about me at all. And that whatever this was hadn't stopped. It had just moved on to somebody else's name for a while. With no reason at all, it couldn't come back around to mine. I drive delivery for a furniture company out of Lufkin, Ellison Home Furnishings, though most folks around here just call it Ellison's. Mostly big stuff. Appliances, mattresses, whole living room sets, stacked 2 deep in the box truck. Headed out to people in the piney woods who don't want to make the drive into town, and back with a couch strapped to the roof of a Buick. Most of my stops are about as normal as a job like that gets. But every so often, dispatch sends you somewhere so far off the paved road your GPS just quits on you, shows you driving through a solid patch of green, like the road itself never got mapped. That's how it was with the house past the tree line, off County Road 4200, outside Crockett. An older woman had called in and ordered a full bedroom set, frame, mattress, a nightstand, dresser, to follow later once she'd saved up and paid the deposit over the phone. She gave me her own directions because, she said, the address never pulled up right on anybody's GPS. Take the county road past the second cattle guard. Follow the tree line about a half mile, and I'd see the house set back off a gravel drive. Easy to miss if I wasn't looking for it. I found it easy enough. Small white farmhouse, tin roof, porch light burning even though it was 2 in the afternoon, and the sun was doing just fine on its own. A woman about 70 met me at the truck before I'd even got the back door up, already smiling, like she'd been standing there a while. She had sweet tea waiting on the porch rail, sweat beading down the glass. And she thanked me kindly for coming all the way out, helped me figure the angle to get the mattress through her hall door, which was narrower than most, told me which way the frame legs folded, so I wouldn't scrape her floor. Just a normal delivery, a little far out, is all. She paid the balance in cash from a coffee can she kept by the door, counted it out slow with fingers that shook a little, the way older hands do, and tipped me 20 on top of it. Said she'd likely be ordering a dresser to match in a month or 2 once she'd saved a bit more. I told her I'd be happy to bring it out whenever she was ready. She said she was in no hurry, neither was I, back then. 6 weeks later, dispatch sent me back out to the same address for that dresser, same directions, same 2 cattle guards, same stretch of pine. There was no house. I don't mean it looked different, or she'd moved out, or somebody had torn it down and hauled off the debris. I mean I stood right where her gravel driveway should have started. And there was no driveway. No gap in the brush wide enough for a truck to have ever come through, let alone a house set back with a porch and a light burning on it. I cut the engine and walked the fence line on foot for a solid 20 minutes, kicking through pine straw, looking for a foundation slab, a chimney stone, a fence post out of line with the rest. Anything that had said a building had stood there inside the last 2 months. The straw under my boots hadn't been walked on in years, not driven on 6 weeks before by a truck carrying 400 pounds of bed frame. Years. I got back in the truck and called the number on the order. It rang the way a disconnected line rings, but not the recent kind, where you still get a recorded voice telling you the number's been shut off. This was the flat, dead, 3-tone kind that sounds like it's never once in its life connected to anything at all. I called it in to dispatch, told them I couldn't locate the address, a thing that happens maybe twice a year out here and usually means bad directions. A customer who mixed up one county road for another. This one didn't sit right with the girl who pulled the file. The original payment had gone 3 and 6 weeks back, Sam back. She could see it right there in the system. A real transaction. Cleared and settled. But when she ran a small authorization on the same card to check it before sending the dresser, $5, just to see if it was live, it came back invalid. Not declined. Invalid. Like the account behind that card had never been opened in the first place. I still had my copy of the original ticket in the clipboard behind my seat. Company policy. We keep a carbon of every signed delivery slip for 30 days in case a customer disputes something. I pulled it out that night under the one working light over the pumps at a gas station outside Grapeland, mostly to prove to myself I hadn't dreamed up an entire afternoon. Her name was there, Vernell Aldridge. In handwriting, I remembered watching her write, slow and careful, the kind of signature that takes its time. The total was there. My own signature under it, same as always. But at the bottom of that ticket, below the line where I usually leave things blank, there were 4 words I did not write. Small, cramped, in a hand that wasn't mine and wasn't hers either. Thank you for coming. I sat in that lot a long while, trying to talk myself into believing I'd written it myself in some tired, half-asleep moment I didn't remember. I've looked at that ticket probably 50 times since. There's no line on it for a message like that. There's nothing to write there at all. I didn't tell anybody about the handwriting for a few weeks. Told the short version of the story around the warehouse is a house that wasn't there, card that never existed, and mostly ain't got the reaction you'd expect. Guys shrugging, saying I'd probably written the address down wrong, that all those county roads out past Crockett looked the same anyhow, except one of them didn't shrug. Roy Fentress has been driving for Ellison's longer than I've been alive, close to it. Quiet man, does his route, clocks out, doesn't say much beyond what the job needs. He caught me alone by the loading dock a few days later, lit a cigarette he wasn't supposed to be smoking to a clothes truck out of the truck, and asked me, careful, exactly which road that was. When I told him, he didn't say anything for a second. Then he said he'd had one just like it, years back, out toward Grapeland on a farm road he couldn't remember the number of anymore. Older woman. Living room set that time, not a bedroom. Same story, she paid cash, tipped him well, said she'd be back for a matching end table once she'd saved up. He went back for it 5 weeks later, and there was no house, no drive, nothing but pasture. He never told anybody at the company. Figured, same as most people would, that he'd taken a wrong turn somewhere and didn't want to look foolish arguing with a piece of land that clearly had nothing on it. Roy still had a key to the back office where Ellison's kept the old paper order logs. The ones from before, everything went digital, boxes going back to the 70s. We went through them together one night after close. Two grown men with flashlights sitting on a concrete floor, going through file boxes that smelled like a closet. Nobody opens. What we were looking for was a code the office used for orders that got voided out, unable to locate. Neither of us expected much. Ellison's is a small company. We figured maybe 3 or 4 of these across 50 years, if that. We found 17. All of them out in that same general pocket of Houston County, the stretch of unpaved roads between Crockett and Grapeland that doesn't show up clean on any map newer than about 1985. All of them, an older woman, alone, ordering bedroom furniture first. Always bedroom furniture first. And a second piece ordered weeks later that never got delivered because by then there was nothing left to deliver it to. The gap between the first order and the vanishing was never exact, but it clustered hard around 6 weeks. Never 5, never 8. 6. Give or take a few days, like clockwork that didn't care what year it was. I went to the Houston County Courthouse in Crockett on a Saturday, told myself I was just being thorough the way you tell yourself things you're past thorough. No, you're past Nels and into something else. The tax assessor's office keeps plat records on every parcel in the county, and a woman there pulled the file on that stretch of County Road 4200 without asking too many questions about why a delivery driver wanted to see it. The land had changed hands on paper 6 separate times since the county started keeping digital records, and probably more before that. Every time, it went the same way. A single owner, always a woman, held the deed until she died, and every time she died without an heir filing a claim. So the parcel reverted to the county for unpaid taxes, sat empty on the books a stretch of years, then quietly got reissued to another name. Aldridge came up 3 times across those 6 transfers. Purdy came up twice. The names traded back and forth like the same handful of families kept marrying into each other, generation after generation, which, in a county that small, isn't even strange on its own. What was strange was that across 6 changes of ownership going back to 1958, not one single structure was ever recorded as being built, permitted, or torn down on that parcel. Not one. As far as Houston County is concerned, there has never been a house on that land at all. The Crockett Library keeps the old Houston County Courier on microfilm going back before the war. And the same clerk who'd helped me at the courthouse pointed me that direction once I stopped bothering to dress up what I was actually looking for. I spent an afternoon scrolling spools of film that smelled like old pennies, hunting the name Aldridge, and found her on the second reel. A short piece from 1958, not even a full column, about a woman named Iva Aldridge, who was known around the county for taking in anybody who needed a place to sit a while, sick neighbors, widowers who couldn't cook for themselves, travelers caught out after dark on roads with no streetlights. The piece said she kept a porch light burning around the clock, rain or shine, so anybody who needed to find her could. There was a photograph with the article, grainy and gray, the way 60-year-old newsprint always is, but I sat in that library chair, looking at a face I'd shaken hands with 6 weeks before I ever walked through that door. Same set to the eyes, same way of holding her chin a little forward when she smiled. The article was 68 years old. If that was the same woman, she'd have to be pushing 130. I brought all of it to the Pines Cafe the next morning, more out of needing to say it out loud to a living person than expecting an answer. And an older woman 2 stools down at the counter Somebody the waitress called Miss Odell, like she'd been coming in every morning of her life, heard enough of what I was saying to turn around on her stool. She didn't act surprised. That's the part that stayed with me longest. She talked about it the way you'd talk about a stretch of road that floods bad every spring. Something everybody local just knows and outsiders find out the hard way. She called it a visiting house. Said her own mother used to talk about them, that every so often somebody out in the county, who's dying alone, with nobody left to sit up with them at the end, gets a house for a little while. A real one, far as anybody who visits it can tell. Somebody comes and keeps the porch light on, and makes the tea, and helps them get their affairs settled, gets their bed made up proper, so they're not doing the hardest thing there is to themselves in an empty room. And once it's finished, the house goes with it, and everything that touched it goes right along, quiet, the way you'd sweep a porch clean. I asked her why furniture. Out of everything I could have asked, that's what came out of me first. She said she figured it wasn't really about the furniture at all. Said a body wants their affairs in order at the end, same as anybody. Wants a decent bed to go in. Wants somebody showing up when they ask for help instead of being left to manage alone. Said the furniture was just the reason to call somebody out. Driving back to Lufkin that afternoon, I kept catching pieces of that visit coming back to me that I hadn't thought once about in 6 weeks. There was a second rocking chair on that porch, empty, angled, like somebody had just gotten up out of it. A pair of men's boots by the door, worn soft at the heel, that didn't match a house that seemed to belong to a woman living alone. She'd said, while we worked the mattress through that hall door, something like my husband always said. This house was built too narrow for its own good. Said it easy. The way you mentioned somebody who just stepped out to the truck for a minute. Not somebody long gone. I hadn't thought twice about it at the time. You don't. When somebody's kind to you and the tea's gone warm and the job needs doing. It's the kind of thing you only hear the second time, in your head weeks later, once you already know to listen for it. I asked Roy. Next time I caught him alone at the dock, if anything about him had changed after his own delivery all those years back. He didn't answer for a good while. Long enough I figured he wasn't going to. Then he said he'd started having the same dream 2 or 3 nights a week for close to a year after. Standing on a porch he'd never actually stood on, looking at a screen door. Never able to get his hand to reach the handle before he woke up. Said it finally stopped, eventually, and he'd never told a soul, not even his wife, because there wasn't a way to say it that didn't sound like something was wrong with him. I didn't tell him, that day, that I'd started being able to describe a back bedroom in that house I was never once shown. Wallpaper with a thin blue stripe. A quilt folded at the foot of a twin bed nobody had ordered furniture for. I couldn't tell you how I know that room. Only that I know it, the way you know a room from your own childhood house. Clear enough to walk through it in the dark. It was Roy who found the thing that changed how I understood all of it. He'd kept turning those old file boxes over on his own time, not able to leave it be either. And about 2 months after our night in the back office, he called me at home, past 10, and read me off a name from one of the oldest tickets in the stack, a U.L. order from 1962, faded near past reading. The driver's initials at the bottom weren't Roy's and weren't mine. They were D.W. My grandfather drove furniture delivery out of Lufkin in the 60s. Before I was ever born. Before my own daddy was much more than a boy riding shotgun with him some Saturdays. His name was Dewey Wren. I'd heard the stories my whole life, mostly from my mother, about how He'd come home some evenings not saying much, and how there was a stretch of route past parked at Crockett he wouldn't denied drive after dark for the rest of his working life, and how nobody in the family ever pushed him hard enough to explain why. Because whatever it was, it clearly cost him something to think about. 3 weeks after that phone call, dispatch handed me a new order. Full bedroom set, paid in full over the phone. An older woman giving her own directions, because the address wouldn't pull up right on any map. County road out past Crockett, past a cattle guard. Follow the tree line till I saw the house. Roy told me not to go. Flat out, more words strung together at once than I'd ever heard out of him. Said whatever this was, it didn't need me specifically. That some other driver could just as easy take the run, that I still had time to hand the ticket back to dispatch and let it be somebody else's Saturday. I took it anyway. I've turned that decision over more times than I can count since, and I still don't have a clean answer for why, except that somewhere between the microfilm and Miss Odell's counter and my grandfather's initials on a 60-year-old ticket, this had stopped being something happening near me and started being something that already had my name written into it long before I ever got the call. I found the house easy, same as always. Same gap in the tree line that isn't there any other day of the year. Same porch light burning at 2 in the afternoon. The woman who met me at the truck wasn't Vernell Aldridge. Different face, different voice, maybe 65 instead of 70. Sweet tea waiting the same as before. She thanked me for coming so far out. Helped me angle the frame through a hall door built too narrow for its own good, and while we worked the legs of it through sideways, she said, easy as anything, that I had good hands for this kind of work. Said it just like the man who used to come out this way a long time ago. Said her mother always spoke well of him. I didn't ask which man, I already knew. I drove back to Lufkin that evening, with the truck empty and the radio off. And when I called it in to close out the run, dispatch had no record of sending me anywhere that day. No ticket number, no address on file. My own delivery log, the one I fill out myself every morning before I leave the yard, showed a blank line where that stop should have been. In my own handwriting, like I'd simply forgotten to write it down, except I never forget to write it down. I still drive County Road 4200 some evenings, windows down, slow enough to catch any gap in the tree line at all. I used to tell myself I was looking for an answer. I know better now. I'm not looking for the house anymore. I'm just getting used to the road, the way you get used to a hallway in a house you already know you'll be walking down again sooner or later, whether you're ready or not. I've waited tables on the night shift at a truck stop diner off I-40 outside Groom for going on 9 years now. And I used to tell people that either meant I had no ambition or that I liked the quiet more than I let on. Probably some of both, if I'm honest about it. You get a particular kind of person coming through between midnight and dawn. Truckers running the overnight to make a delivery window. A handful of locals who can't sleep and don't want to sit alone in their own kitchen. The occasional tourist who took a wrong exit off the interstate and ended up a lot further from anywhere than they meant to be. You learn the faces out here. You learn what somebody's going to order before they say a word, just from the way they carry themselves through the door. The man I want to tell you about started coming in about 4 years after I did, though it took me a long while to understand that started isn't really the right word for him. He always came alone, always between 2 and 3 in the morning. Always took the same corner booth, the one facing the door, like he wanted a clear line of sight on whoever walked in. He ordered the same thing every single time. Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, dry, and he never changed it. Not once. Not even to ask for a refill, because his cup would be sitting exactly empty by the time I circled back around with the pot. Like he'd worked out the timing years ago and never had a reason to check it again. He talked in a whisper. Not a shy whisper, not a sick one, the kind that still carries fine across a quiet dining room. Like a man who'd decided a long time back that talking any louder just wasn't worth the effort anymore. Thank you. When I set the plate down, have a good night when he left. Always cash. Always the exact amount. Folded once, tucked half under the saucer. He never once asked for change. For the first year or so, I didn't think much about him beyond the ordinary kind of noticing you do with any regular. Waitressing trains you to catalog people without meaning to. Then I started noticing something else, and I want to be careful how I say this part, because I don't mean he'd aged well. The way people say about somebody in their 50s who still runs 3 miles a day. I mean, I could have set a photograph of him from my first month serving him right next to how he looked 4 years on, and you would not have found a single difference. Same gray at the temples, same thin white crease cutting through his left eyebrow, same frayed patch of stitching coming loose on his jacket cuff, in the exact same spot, never any worse. Never mended either. Waitresses notice things like a loose thread because it's the job, and every detail I'd cataloged on that man stayed locked exactly where I'd first found it. Like the years were moving around him instead of through him. I told myself for a while it was just good genes and a boring life. Then one slow Tuesday, I finally said something to Carla, another night waitress who'd been at that truck stop a good deal longer than me. I expected her to laugh, tell me I'd been pulling too many doubles. Instead, she went quiet in a way I hadn't seen out of her before. And she told me he'd been coming in since before she started too. Same booth, same order, same whisper. I asked her how far back that actually was, and she couldn't tell me. Not wouldn't, couldn't. She said she'd tried once years back to land on an actual memory of the first time she ever laid eyes on him, and she never could pin one down. He was just already there, the way the fry station is already there when you clock in for a shift eat. Then she asked me, plain and direct, to let it go. Not because she thought there was danger in it, because thinking too hard on it had cost her a solid month of sleep once, and she didn't want that landing on me too. I might have actually let it go if it wasn't for Dale. Dale's been running this stretch of highway for something like 35 years, hauling freight up, out of Amarillo and points south, and he's one of those old truckers who fills silence with talk, which suited me fine most nights. One evening, over his usual chicken fried steak, he tipped his chin toward the corner booth and asked, easy as anything, if the quiet fella still came around. I said he did. Dale got a look on his face I didn't much care for, and told me he used to see a man who matched that description, whisper voice and all, at a different diner that used to sit on this exact stretch of road before it burned down sometime in the early 90s and got rebuilt into what's standing here now. Dale would have been young then, hauling his very first routes. That put this man on this highway at more than 30 years running, not 4. Dale didn't say it like it spooked him. He said it the way you'd mention a landmark that had simply always been there, and then went right back to complaining about his knees. That's the night I stopped being able to leave it alone. A couple weeks later, during a dead stretch on a Sunday, I got into some old storage boxes in the back office. Ones nobody had touched since the place changed hands back in the 80s. mixed in with faded receipts and a busted cash register drawer. I found a handful of photographs from what looked like an opening day or some kind of anniversary. Back when the diner had a different name painted across the front glass. In one of them, grainy, black and white, shot from behind the counter. Looking out over the dining room, there's a man sitting alone in the corner booth. The one facing the door. I couldn't make out his face clean enough to swear to it under oath, but I didn't need to. I knew that booth. I knew that particular way of sitting, hands folded flat on the table, shoulders squared toward the entrance. I'd watched it for years, so I did something I'm still not entirely sure I can explain, except that once you start pulling on a thread like that, you can't just stop halfway through. On one of my days off, I drove into town and went by the little historical society. Groom keeps in the old rail depot, more out of boredom on the part of the woman who runs it than any real demand for the place. Her name's Ruth, and she keeps boxes of clippings going back to before the interstate replaced the old road, back when this whole corridor was still Route 66. I told her I was curious about old wrecks out past the truck stop. She didn't even blink before she pulled a folder. Bad stretch, she said, always had been, long before it ever got repaved into I-40. She found me a clipping from an ice storm in the late 60s. A freight truck that jacked on black ice, not 2 miles from where the diner sits now. The driver died at the scene. It took a few days to get a positive identification because the cab had burned. The name in that clipping was Harlan Voss, 34 years old at the time, driving a route for a lumber and hardware outfit out of Amarillo, hauling a load that never made it where it was going. What stopped my breath wasn't the name itself. It was a smaller detail buried near the bottom of the article, something the reporter had pulled from the dispatch company, that Voss had radioed in not long before the wreck to say he was running behind, and intended to make his delivery window regardless, that he always made his window rain or ice or otherwise. I sat there thinking about 4 years of watching a man time his coffee cup down to the minute, never late, never early. And I had to lower myself into the chair in Ruth's little office before I could finish reading the rest. I didn't say a word to him about it. Not yet. But something shifted in how I watched him after that. And maybe he could tell, because not long after, something happened that changed how I felt about him for good. It was a rough night later than usual, and a man came through the door. I didn't like the look of from the second the bell rang, agitated, smelling like he'd already been drinking somewhere else. The kind of customer that trains you to keep the counter between yourself and him without even thinking about it. He got loud with me over nothing, leaned in over the register close enough that my stomach dropped. And I remember thinking nobody else in the place was near enough to help if it went further than words. Then I noticed the corner booth was empty. The quiet man was standing about 4 feet behind that customer, not saying a thing, not doing anything you could point to and call a threat. The agitated man turned around, looked at him a beat too long, and walked straight out without paying his tab. I never got an explanation for it. I never asked for one. A few months after that, he did something he had never once done in all the years I'd known him. He spoke first. I was clearing his plate, mentioned offhand that I was tired and thinking about just taking 40 straight home instead of my usual back way through the county road. And he said, quiet as ever, but with something almost urgent behind it, that I ought to take the old road that night instead. I didn't argue. By then, I'd stopped needing a reason to trust him. I found out the next afternoon, from Dale over the radio chatter at the counter, that there'd been a 5-car pileup on 40 in the exact stretch I would have been driving, Black ice again. The same kind of night that had taken Harlan Voss decades before. Nobody died, but they closed the highway for 6 hours. I sat with that a long time. I mentioned it to Dale, eventually, careful, not the whole story. Just that I'd had a bad feeling about the road that night, and it turned out right. Dale didn't seem surprised in the slightest. He said there were men like that scattered up and down this whole corridor, not just here in Groom. A fella he swore by outside Shamrock, who always waved trucks off a bridge deck right before it iced over. Another one folks used to talk about near the Amarillo scales who'd vanish the second you looked at him twice. He said it like he was describing a weather pattern, not a ghost story. Like it was just one more thing you picked up about this road if you drove it long enough. That was the moment the whole thing stopped feeling like something strange about one man in one diner and started feeling like something built into the road itself. Something a lot bigger than I'd ever let myself imagine. I finally asked him straight one night. I'd rehearsed it enough times that it came out steadier than I expected it to. I asked if his name was Harlan. He didn't answer right away. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked down at the table instead of at me. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't a yes, and it wasn't a no. He said that name hadn't been used on him in a long, long time, and that he was surprised somebody had gone to the trouble of finding it. That was all. But it was enough. Whatever careful distance he'd kept for 4 years cracked just slightly that night, and I understood I hadn't imagined any of it. Not the age, not the timing, none of it. The last piece landed almost by accident. My grandfather's old barn still stands out on family land outside town, and growing up, I heard the story 100 times about how the barn raising got delayed weeks past when it was supposed to happen, how the hardware and lumber the family had ordered never showed up, and how a neighbor finally had to drive all the way into Amarillo for replacements. I'd never once connected that story to anything until I went back through Ruth's folder a second time and found a freight manifest tucked in behind the newspaper clipping. The delivery address on that manifest for the load Harlan Voss never finished hauling was my grandfather's address. The shipment that never came was headed for our barn. I haven't told him I know that part. I'm not sure I ever will, and I'm not sure it would change a single thing if I did. What it changed was how I understood the last 9 years of my own life, and Carla's 20 before that, and however many women poured his coffee before either of us ever clocked in. I used to think Carla steered me toward that section of the diner, the one with his booth in it, because it was the section nobody else wanted the trouble of. Now I think she was handing something off, the same way somebody handed it off to her. I think about that most nights when I catch myself training our newest hire to take that corner booth, without complaint, without asking too many questions about the regular who never varies his order. I don't explain it to her the way I wish somebody had explained it to me. I just tell her to keep his coffee cup full and let him be. And to say goodnight when he leaves because whatever he's still driving toward, he never finished that run. And until he does, I figure the least any of us can do out here at 3 in the morning is make sure he's never left waiting on something as small as a warm plate. Marcus and I ran team for 6 years before I went solo, and I want to say up front that I've had a lot of partners since, and none of them came close. You spend that many years 3 feet from another man in a box that smells like diesel and gas station coffee. You learn things about him that his own wife might not know. I knew Marcus hummed off-key when he was nervous. I knew he'd eat the crusts off a sandwich first and save the middle for last, like he was rationing the good part. And I knew, somewhere around year 2, that the man could read a road better than anybody I'd ever sat next to. Not in a way you could explain to somebody who'd never seen it. He'd be half asleep in the bunk outside Amarillo, and he'd sit straight up and say, "Over, something's wrong with the second trailer." And 9 times out of 10, he was right before the gauges ever told us so. I used to ask him how he knew. He'd just shrug and say the truck talks if you're willing to listen to it. He's the one who hung the name Detour on me. First year we ran together, after I missed an exit outside Narration and cost us 4 hours climbing back down out of the mountains. He wouldn't let it go. Called me Detour on the CB for the rest of the run, then kept doing it for 6 years after, long past the point it was funny to anybody but him. Nobody else ever called me that. It wasn't a handle I used with dispatch or with other drivers. It was just a thing between the two of us, the kind of nickname that only means something because of who's saying it. His knees gave out before mine did. Too many years climbing in and out of that cab, too many miles sitting wrong in the sleeper, and by year 6, he couldn't do the long hauls anymore. He took a local job, short runs, home to his wife Diane every night, and I went solo because I couldn't picture running with anybody else after him. We stayed close, called each other most weeks. He'd tell me about being home for supper like it was the strangest luxury in the world. 2 years ago, he was running a route outside Plainview that he'd driven 100 times. Roads he probably could have done with his eyes shut and his rig hydroplaned and rolled twice. I found out standing at a payphone outside a truck stop near Lubbock, because my cell never held a signal out on that stretch, and I hadn't bothered fixing it. I hung up that phone and walked outside and sat on my own truck's bumper for the better part of an hour. Not crying exactly, just sitting there because I didn't know what a body was supposed to do with news like that. There was one thing that bothered me for a long while after, and I never told anybody because it felt small next to everything else. Dispatch first told me it happened around dusk, but when Diane forwarded me the paperwork weeks later, so I'd have it for my own peace, the official time on the report was closer to 2 in the morning. I told myself first accounts are always wrong, that somebody misheard something over a bad connection, that grief makes you chew on details that don't matter. Mostly I believed that. Mostly. I quit running I-27 after that, best I could manage it. Took the long way through Amarillo, whenever the load allowed. Ate the extra miles and the extra hours just so I wouldn't have to pass that overpass outside Plainview where they found what was left of his rig. 2 years of rerouting around 60 miles of highway because I couldn't stomach driving past the spot. Then 3 months ago, dispatch called with a delivery window so tight. There wasn't a version of the route that let me avoid it. My own truck was down for a transmission rebuild, so they put me, a loner, out of the terminal, a rig I'd never sat in before, still smelling like somebody else's cigarettes. I told myself I'd just get through the 60 miles like any other stretch of road. Kept my eyes forward, tried not to read the mile markers too close. Whoever drove that truck before me had left the CB on Channel 19, which I noticed when I climbed in and almost switched off out of habit. Since I hadn't run with the radio on in 2 years, I don't know why I left it. Maybe I wanted something other than my own thoughts for company on that particular stretch. I turned the volume down low and let it hiss along in the background, mostly dead air, the way 19 usually is out in that country at night. Somewhere past Plainview the static broke and a voice came through, calm, unhurried, and it said, Detour, you copy. I want to be honest with you about what that did to me. I hadn't heard that name spoken out loud since before the funeral. Not from Diane, not from anybody. It was a name that belonged to exactly one person, and that person had been in the ground 2 years. My hands went cold on the wheel before my head caught up to why. The voice didn't wait for me to answer. It said, "Slow it down, brother." Black ice past the overpass, same spot that got the Miller boy last winter. I hadn't heard about any Miller boy. I didn't know the name at all. But I took my foot off the gas without deciding to. The way you flinch before you understand what you're flinching from. I came up on that overpass doing maybe 40 instead of the 65 I'd been running. And there's it was. It ran. A sheet of black ice catching my headlights wrong. And a pickup already jackknifed off the shoulder from somebody who hadn't slowed down at all. If I'd come through at speed, I don't believe I'd be telling you this. I got stopped safe, hazards going, and got out to check on the pickup driver, who was shaken up bad but breathing. Nothing broken that I could see. I called it in on my cell once I had enough signal, stayed with him till the trooper and the ambulance made it out. And when my hands finally stopped shaking enough to hold the CB mic steady, I keyed up channel 19 and asked, flat out, who that was and how they knew that name. Nothing came back, not static exactly, not silence exactly either. Just the particular kind of nothing you get off a channel that was never occupied to begin with, the kind of nothing that tells you there was never a transmitter out there that night at all. I didn't sleep much for a few days after that. When I finally got the loaner back to the terminal, I asked the shop foreman to run a check on the CB before I turned it in. Told him I thought I'd picked up something strange on it and wanted to know if the unit was even working right. He pulled the defect sheet on that rig and showed me the previous driver had already flagged an intermittent short in the antenna ground about 3 weeks prior. Said, reception out past Plainview should have been garbage at best on that unit. In and out, nothing you could hold a clean sentence on. He wasn't trying to spook me. He was just telling me what the paperwork said. It didn't explain anything. It just meant whatever I'd heard shouldn't have come through clean the way it did. I looked into the Miller boy after because I needed to know if any part of what I'd heard was real, or if grief had just found a new way to mess with a tired man's head. There had been a wreck on that exact overpass the winter before mine. A young guy named Miller. Black ice. Same curve. It was all there in the local paper, a few lines. Nothing dramatic. I never told the trooper who'd taken my statement that night that I already knew that name before he mentioned the old case to me. I didn't know how to say it out loud without sounding like I needed help. A couple weeks later, I was sitting at a counter in a truck stop outside Lubbock, and I mentioned it. Careful. To an older driver, a few stools down. Not the whole story. Just that I'd caught something strange on 19 out past Plainview. He didn't laugh at me. He got quiet instead and said he'd heard other fellas talk about that stretch over the years. Said there was an old story going around some of the regulars about somebody who still called in trouble out there, and he'd always figured it for the kind of thing truckers tell each other to stay awake on a long night. He said it different now, watching my face. Said maybe it wasn't only a story. I called Diane not long after that, mostly to check on her, the way I did every few months. And somewhere in that conversation, I ended up telling her what happened on the overpass. She went quiet a long moment, and then she told me something I never knew. Marcus had complained to the county about that stretch of road, months before his own crash. Said the drainage was bad, and it iced over faster than the rest of the highway. Said he'd nearly gone off himself once, and called it in personally. told a coworker more than once that somebody was going to get killed out there if the county didn't fix it. Nothing ever got fixed. Budget, paperwork, the kind of thing that takes a death to move. The same trooper who'd worked my incident had worked Marcus's crash 2 years before. Small county, same jurisdiction, and I finally asked him if I could see the old report. He let me, off the books, more out of kindness than procedure. The skid marks on Marcus's crash started well before the curve itself. Heavy. Braking. A hard correction. More than you'd expect from a man simply losing traction on ice he didn't see coming. The trooper told me, without me asking, that he'd always figured Marcus saw something in the road that night. A deer, maybe, though they never found any sign of one. He said it like a man who'd carried that little unresolved detail around for 2 years and was glad to finally say it to somebody. I sat with that for a long time. The idea that the same man who'd reached to slow me down hadn't had anybody to slow him down himself. That he'd spent his last seconds fighting a wheel over something none of us would ever get to know, alone in a cab that used to have me in the other seat. Months went by after that. I kept running 27 instead of avoiding it, kept the CB low on Channel 19 the whole way past the overpass, and mostly it stayed exactly what it's supposed to be out there, quiet and empty. Then, one clear night, nothing wrong with the road, no ice, no warning needed. The static broke again for just a few seconds. It wasn't a hazard call this time. It just said, easy as anything. You're doing fine, Detour. Go on home. Nothing else came after it. I didn't ask who it was that time. I think some part of me already knew, and asking felt like it would have broken something I didn't want broken. It was almost half a year later that I ran into the pickup driver from that first night, recognized my rig parked at the same Lubbock truck stop, where I'd first said any of this out loud to a stranger. He came over and thanked me properly, said he'd thought about that night a lot, said it had eaten at him enough that he'd gone digging into the Miller Boy case himself. Curious how another wreck had happened at that exact spot the year before his own. He told me something that put a chill straight through me, according to the dispatch log. From that night, Miller himself had radioed in a warning about black ice on that overpass, not 20 minutes before his own truck went off it, telling whoever was listening that somebody was going to die out there if they weren't careful. He never got the chance to take his own advice. I don't know what to do with that. Not really. I don't know if it means the road pulls something out of the men who die on it. Some last decent instinct to warn the next driver, even when it's already too late, to save themselves. I don't know if Marcus is the one who's been out there this whole time, or if he's just the one who finally found his way to me. I don't know how a busted CB antenna picks up a voice it shouldn't be able to hold. And I've stopped needing an answer for it the way I used to. What I know is I drive that stretch now, instead of running 60 miles out of my way to avoid it. I keep Channel 19 on low the whole way past that overpass. Every single time, and I haven't heard the voice since that second night. And I don't know if I ever will again. But if there's a chance, my old partner is still out there somewhere on that road. Still watching for the driver, riding shotgun in his head after all these years. I'd rather stay close enough to hear him than spend the rest of my life driving around the one place he might be. I've hauled frac sand out of the Permian Basin for going on 9 years now, mostly runs between Fort Stockton and the pads up around Orla and Mentone. If you've never driven 285 at night, I'll tell you what everybody who has already knows. It's flat. It's black, and outside of the light towers strobing on the horizon over some pad site, There's nothing out there to look at. No towns for 40, 50 miles, some stretches. You roll through Loving County, and you're in the least populated county in the entire country. I looked that up. Once, sitting at a red light that doesn't exist anymore, because the state finally put a real intersection in a few years back. That night I was running empty, heading back down toward Pecos to load again, before my hours ran out. I had about 4 left on my clock, and I wanted to make it in before I had to shut down for the night. Somewhere past the Loving County line, static hissing, on Channel 19 because nobody talks out there anymore. Not really. I saw him standing on the shoulder. Older guy, maybe 60, wearing a canvas jacket. That didn't make sense for the heat we still had at 10 o'clock at night in July. He wasn't waving anybody down. He was just standing there, facing the road, like he'd been standing there a while and wasn't in any hurry about it. I want to be honest with you. You don't stop for people standing on 285 at night. Every driver who runs that road has heard the stories. And there's a reason. The highway patrol put up all those signs about suspicious activity along there. But something about how still he was standing got a hold of me. And before I'd really decided anything, I was already on the brakes. He climbed in without me exactly inviting him to. Told me his name, and I could not tell you now what it was, which bothers me a good deal, more than it probably should. Said he needed to get to a town called Cardenas. I have run that highway more years than I care to add up, and I had never once heard of a Cardenas, Texas. Told him so. He just said, real calm, that it was there. That I needed to take the road past the second cattle guard, then hang a left where the fence line turned. I keep a paper map in the glove box, old habit, since the GPS drops out on half of 285 anyway, and there was no county road matching anything like that, anywhere close to where he was pointing. We drove on maybe 15 minutes. He talked, but not so much to me as past me, like he was describing something, only he could see out that windshield. Said the town had a church with a bell that didn't ring anymore. Said his sister was buried out there. Somewhere in that stretch, I quit answering him back, because the hair on my arms had stood up and stayed up. And I was doing that thing where you keep your eyes locked dead ahead, because you don't want to be the one who looks over first. A jackrabbit cut across the beam, and I hit the brakes. Hard, pure reflex. And in that half second, where the cab bounced, I looked over anyway. Seat was empty. Belt still buckled across nothing. Door still shut tight. I checked my mirrors, checked the shoulder for a good quarter mile, thinking maybe I'd blacked out somehow and let him off without remembering it. There was nobody walking that shoulder, no lights behind me at all. I called my dispatcher, told her I needed a minute, didn't tell her why. Made Pecos about 40 minutes later and sat in the pilot lot with my hazards going until it started getting light. I didn't sleep much that morning before my next run, and somewhere in there I remembered the dash cam I'd had mounted on the visor for going on 2 years now, mostly because insurance rates being what they are. A lot of us owner-operators run one, just to cover ourselves if some four-wheeler pulls in front of us and blames the wreck on the truck. I pulled the card and watched the clip back, sitting in the cab with the engine off. The passenger door opens right on schedule, right where I remember it happening. The seat cushion gives just slightly, like something settled onto it. My voice is on there, asking him where he needed to get to. His voice answers. But at no point in that footage does anything actually cross from the shoulder into that seat. No boot. No hand on the door frame, no shape at all. Like the camera caught everything around the moment and just skipped the moment itself. I didn't tell anybody about that. I just saved the file and didn't watch it again. It was a few weeks on, sitting at the same pilot in Picos, when I brought it up half-joking to a driver I know named Ruiz. Hauls water for the same outfit I load for. Didn't even get all the way through, describing the jacket before his face changed. He asked me, flat out, if the man had said something about his sister being in the ground out there. I hadn't told him that part yet. Come to find out, Ruiz had heard the same story, almost word for word, from a driver who'd since quit the business entirely, and he'd always figured it for one of those stories that gets passed around to truck, stops until nobody remembers where it started. Except now I was telling him I'd lived it myself, same road, same jacket, same word, Cardenas. That's what got me digging. On a day, I was deadheading back through Picos with nothing loaded. I stopped in at the little local history room they keep at the county library and asked the volunteer, working the desk, if she'd ever heard of a Cardenas. She didn't even have to think about it. Pulled a thin folder and a plat map that showed a real town, a real cluster of buildings sitting off what used to be a county road between the Loving and Reeves County line. Existed from sometime in the 20s up until the late 50s. Never made it onto a state highway map I've ever seen. And it isn't on any map printed since. She had more in that folder than I expected. Way that town disappeared wasn't the usual story you hear about these little ranching communities just drying up over a generation. Cardenas went fast, in less than a year, because a company called Basin Crown Oil had proven up a big field under that ranch land and bought the whole Tuck community out at once in 1959. Quiet, families relocated, mineral rights czarred, rights and surface rights signed over together, and the little town's plat just never made it into the next printing of the county map. Nobody voted to abandon Cardenas. Somebody paid to make it disappear. I asked her, since the man in my truck had mentioned a sister buried there, if there was any record of a Reyes family. She dug a little further and came back with a name, Alma Reyes, and a death record from 1958, tied to a tank battery blowout at a Basin Crown well site, sitting right up against the Reyes homestead. That's the year before the buyout went through. Family lore in that folder said it was Alma's death, more than any check the company wrote, that finally pushed what was left of the Reyes family to take the money and go. No lawsuit, no headline, nothing in any paper anybody kept. On my very next scheduled load, checking my ticket before I pulled out, I noticed the pad I was delivering sand to was called Sabine Draw. Something about that name sat wrong with me now. So on a whim, I asked the pumper on location, casual, as I could manage, exactly where the lease line sat, relative to the old county road. Took a courthouse friend of mine about a week to lay the modern plat over that old one from the library folder. But when he did, it was plain as anything. Sabine Draw Pad sits almost dead center of the old Cardenas town section. Every load I have ever hauled to that pad has been going straight into fracking the ground under a town that got erased to make room for exactly that. I couldn't let it sit after that. On a day off, I borrowed my nephew's truck since my rig wasn't built for a 2-track, and went looking in daylight for that second cattle guard and the fence turn. Took 2 wrong turns and 1 bad scare getting stuck in blow sand before I found it. Caliche foundation stones, poking up through drifted sand, a bell laid over on its side, half buried near what must have been the chapel. and a fenced quarter-acre with a handful of leaning limestone markers. I knelt down and cleared sand off the base of one with my hand. Alma Reyes. Same dates the library folder had given me. Everything the man in my cab had told me was sitting right there under my boots. Standing there, I noticed the fence looked freshly mended in one corner, fresh orange survey flagging out past it, and a metal sign zip tied to the wire that read "No Trespassing, Crown Basin Resources Minerals LLC," with a date stamped on it from within the past year. Whatever this place was to me, it clearly wasn't nothing to somebody else right now, today, not 60 years ago. I was still crouched there, taking a picture of the marker on my phone, when a white pickup with a company decal rolled up slow on the 2-track. Fellow that got out wasn't hostile exactly, but he wasn't friendly either. Asked what business I had on the lease. In trying to sound reasonable, he let slip more than he probably meant to. Said there'd been some back and forth with the state over where exactly the old cemetery boundary sat, on account of a new pad location that was supposed to go in about 60 yards from where we were standing. Meaning somebody official already knew good and well those graves were there, and the company was working to manage around them rather than report them properly. A few weeks after that, a roughneck I know from the pads mentioned, once I started asking questions, that a dozer crew grading a new location out that way last year had hit bone and grave goods. Work stopped about 4 days. A state archaeologist came out quiet, and the whole business got handled without ever once making the Picos paper. That settled it for me. This wasn't an accident nobody knew about. Somebody had known, and chosen quiet over right. So, I called the Texas Historical Commission's Unmarked Cemetery program myself. Gave them the coordinates off my phone, the name Alma Reyes, everything, the library folder, and my own 2 eyes had given me. Filed the same with the county. Figured if I didn't put it on record somewhere official, it'd get quietly paved. Over the next time somebody needed 60 more yards. Within 2 weeks, my dispatcher told me, careful about how she said it, that Crown Basin's transportation coordinator had specifically asked iska on the Sabine draw. Lease going forward. No reason given. A broker I'd worked with for years got noticeably cold on the phone not long after. As an owner-operator, losing that lease's freight was a real hit, not something I could just shrug off come tax time. Around then, the library volunteer, who'd taken her own interest in it by that point, came back with something that stopped me flat. Digging through a more recent obituary file, she'd found a man named Feliciano Rayo Rises, called Chano by folks who knew him, born in Cardenas, the last livings, who'd never fully left the area, lived alone out in a trailer past Orla for decades after the buyout. A rancher checking a stock tank fence had reported him missing. About 10 days before the night, I picked up my passenger. Search and rescue had looked and come up with nothing. Eventually stood the search down. I followed that with one more call to the same rancher who told me Chano's body had in fact turned up close to 2 weeks after my ride, out along a stretch of 285, not far from where I'd picked the man up. Apparent exposure. What stopped me cold wasn't that part. It was that the estimated time of death, best the coroner could pin it, sat right on top of. Maybe just before. The night I had him sitting in my passenger seat, asking me to drive him home to his sister. I'm not going to sit here and tell you what that means. I've turned it over plenty of nights since, and I don't have anything better than a guess. What I can tell you is what came of it. With the coordinates, the name, the death record, and the historical commission now formally on it, things moved faster than I expected. The state made Crown Basin reroute that new pad location and put up a proper fenced boundary around what's now on record as the Cardenas Cemetery. Alma got a real marker eventually, and once Chano was identified and reinterred beside her, he got one too. Little more than a year after that first night, the county put up a small, roadside historical marker for the town of Cardenas itself. First time in over 60 years, anybody's officially admitted it was ever there. I drove up for the unveiling on a day off. Didn't say much to anybody. Just stood at the back and felt like I'd done something worth doing, even though I still can't explain what actually happened in my cab that night. Months on from all that, I was running empty again on 285, hours ticking down same as always, and I saw somebody else standing on that same stretch of shoulder. Not the same man. Different build, different era of clothes, and this one wasn't facing the road waiting on a ride. He was facing away from me, out toward the light towers, working the horizon, like he was just watching the pads run. I didn't stop. I made that rule for myself, and I've kept it since. But as my headlight swept past him, I understood something I can't prove, and don't much want to test, which is that Cardenas probably isn't the only small town this basin swallowed Quabitswoldikayet for what was sitting underneath it, and that shoulder probably won't be the last one I pass with somebody standing on it, waiting on somebody to finally stop the truck and listen. The Zenenades I've dispatched for a little regional outfit out of Odessa for 6 years, mostly short-haul stuff. Pipe, cement, oil field freight, moving between yards and pads within a couple 100 miles. You get to know your driver's voices better than you know some of your own family, because you're on the radio and the phone with them for 10, 12 hours some days. You learn who takes their coffee black, who's got a kid with an ear infection, who slows down talking when they're tired enough to be dangerous. Denny was one of my quiet ones. 14 years driving, never had an incident on his record, the kind of guy you stop worrying about because he's never given you a reason to. That Tuesday, he was running a load of drill pipe out to a pad west of Monaghan's, should have been back by mid-afternoon. Around 1 o'clock, his tracking unit pinged a stop that wasn't on his route. A shoulder stop on I-20, a little east of the Monaghan's exit. Happens all the time. Guys pull over for the bathroom, for a phone call. I didn't think twice about it until it hadn't moved in 40 minutes. I called his cell. Straight to voicemail, no rings, which told me the phone was either dead or off, and Denny never let his phone die, not once in 6 years. I tried the CB. We still keep a base station in the office because half our drivers won't shut theirs off, even with a phone in their pocket. And got nothing but the hiss you get out there when there's no other truck close enough to hear you. I called the Highway Patrol non-emergency line because I didn't want to be the dispatcher who cried wolf over a guy taking a long lunch. They found the rig about 20 minutes later, sitting on the shoulder, exactly where his ping said it would be. Engine running, door open on the driver's side. His hard hat and his thermos sitting on the passenger seat still warm. The trooper told me over the phone, still warm, like he'd just stepped out to check a tire. Hazards on. His logbook was filled out current up to a stop that didn't exist yet. A delivery time he hadn't reached, which is a small thing until you sit with it a while and realize a man can't log a stop he hasn't made. No footprints in the shoulder gravel. No skid marks anywhere near the truck. And the dash cam, this is the part that still gets me, had its internal clock frozen at 1:14 p.m., looping the same 11 seconds of corrupted static over and over until the trooper pulled the card 2 days later. They searched the caliche pits and the fence lines on both sides of that stretch for 2 days straight. Nothing. No blood, no sign he'd been struck, no sign he'd walked off on his own 2 feet. No struggle in the cab, nothing missing from it either. His wallet was still in the console, his phone still in the cup holder. He had a wife and 2 boys in Odessa. For a long time, I told myself that was the whole story. A man who existed and then didn't, and some things just don't get an answer. I saw his wife sometimes at the HEB on Highway 191, and for the first year or so, neither of us said anything about it. Because there wasn't anything left to say that hadn't already been said to a trooper, a chaplain, a company lawyer. We got a new policy out of it. Nobody parks on that stretch without checking in first. And if a driver goes 15 minutes without moving, dispatch calls immediately instead of waiting. I told myself that was the closure this job was going to give me. I was wrong about that, and it took me the better part of 3 years to find out how wrong. It started with the dash cam footage, actually, which I shouldn't have still had a copy of, but our fleet tech guy had pulled it onto a company drive before he handed the original card to the trooper, in case corporate wanted it for the insurance claim. I watched those 11 seconds more times than I'd ever admit to anybody. And one night, maybe 8 months after it happened, I noticed the static wasn't random. It had a rhythm to it, a stutter that repeated in almost the same place every loop, which isn't what equipment failure looks like. Equipment failure is messy. This was too even. I took it to a guy I know who does IT work for a couple of the bigger carriers in Midland. Told him I found some corrupted footage on an old card and wanted to know if it was salvageable. He looked at it for maybe 10 minutes and told me flat out that card hadn't failed. It had been reformatted, and reformatted badly, by somebody who was trying to make it look like a crash instead of a wipe. He said whoever did it either didn't know what they were doing or wanted it to be obvious to anybody who looked close enough, which is its own kind of unsettling once you sit with it. Either Denny knew how to do that himself, or somebody else had been in that cab with him before the trooper ever got there. I went back through his personnel file after that, told myself I was just tidying up old records, and found an emergency contact I'd never noticed before, not his wife. A brother in Midland he'd never once mentioned to me in 6 years of daily conversation. I called. The number. The man on the other end was careful with his words, in a way that people usually only are when they've had practice being careful. He wouldn't say much, but he let it slip that Denny had been asking around about work up north the back end. Fields, like he was looking for a reason to leave West Texas behind. That didn't square with what his wife had told the troopers, that everything at home had been fine, normal, nothing out of the ordinary. I still had access to his company cell records for a few more weeks before the account got closed out, and I pulled them, telling myself it was for the file, not for me. Buried in the last month of calls was a number with a Midland exchange he'd rung 4 times in 10 days. Always short calls, 2 or 3 minutes. I ran it down eventually, and it turned out to belong to a bail bondsman's office, which is not a phone number, a man with no record calls for fun. A public records search at the courthouse, the kind you can do for free if you know what you're looking for. Turned up something else. Denny had been named, not charged, just named, in a theft investigation 8 months before he disappeared, tied to a pipe yard out on the Kermit Highway, where inventory had been coming up short against the manifests. I checked our own trip logs against that, and sure enough, that yard was the same one he'd loaded, out of that Tuesday morning. I started asking around quietly, the way you do in an industry small enough that everybody's one phone call from everybody else. A dispatcher I knew at a competing outfit mentioned, almost as an aside, that they'd had a phantom stop of their own 2 years before Denny's. Same stretch of I-20, same shoulder. Their driver had turned up fine physically, but he wouldn't talk about what happened and quit driving inside a month. It took me 2 weeks to track that man down. He was working the register at a car wash off Business 20 in Odessa, and when I first asked him about it, he shook his head and said he didn't remember much, which is the kind of thing people say when they remember everything. I bought him lunch, didn't push, let him get there on his own, and eventually he told me he'd pulled over that day because there was a truck ahead of him on the shoulder with its hazards going, and a man flagging him down, saying he'd broken down and needed help. He said. The man asked him to look away for a second, help him with something at the back of the trailer. And when he turned back around, both the man and the broken down truck were gone, like they'd never been there. There was cash tucked under his wiper blade when he got back in his cab. Several $100s. And he never called it in because he didn't know how to explain taking it. And because some part of him understood, he'd been paid to forget what he saw. That's when it stopped looking like a disappearance and started looking like a setup. Somebody was staging breakdowns on that stretch of highway to get specific drivers to stop. And Denny hadn't been the first, and he probably wasn't going to be the last. I pulled every load Denny had run out of that Kermit yard in his final month and laid the manifests out on my kitchen table one night. Like I actually knew what I was looking for. Almost every one of them had been signed off by the same yard foreman, a man named Royce, who I'd spoken to on the phone plenty of times, but never met in person. When I asked around about him a few weeks later, I learned he'd been let go, or transferred. Nobody seemed totally sure which, right around the time Denny vanished. No public reason given. He just stopped being the name on the paperwork. I remembered something then that I'd filed away without thinking much of it. A week before, he disappeared. Denny had asked me an odd question over the radio, whether dispatch ever tracked pipe by weight instead of just by count. At the time I told him weight wasn't something we logged, just piece counts against the manifest, and he said something like, didn't figure so, and moved on. I didn't think about it again until 3 years later, lying awake, realizing that's exactly the kind of question a man asks when he's found a joint of pipe that weighs wrong and wants to know if anybody besides him would ever notice. Drill pipe is hollow. It's been used to move things across this part of the country that have nothing to do with drilling, and it's not exactly a secret if you've been in the oil field long enough to hear the stories. I started to believe Denny had found something inside a joint on one of his loads, or been asked to carry something he didn't sign up for, and that whatever happened on that shoulder wasn't random violence. It was cleanup, which led me somewhere I hadn't let myself go before. The possibility that Denny hadn't been taken at all, that the hazards, the running engine, the open door, might have been staged by his own hand to buy himself time before anybody came looking. It fit in a way nothing else had fit, except for the wallet, except for the phone. A man planning to vanish clean takes his ID, takes his cash, doesn't leave a thermos still warm on the seat like he meant to be believed, unless somebody was waiting up the road to hand him a new version of both. I thought about that brother in Midland again, the one his wife had never mentioned, the one who chose his words like a man used to being careful, and I started to wonder if he wasn't blood at all, but a contact, a piece of some quiet arrangement for people who needed to disappear from a situation before that situation disappeared them permanently. I finally drove myself down to the sheriff's department and laid all of it out for whoever would listen. The original detective on the case had retired 2 years prior, and the one who'd inherited the file barely remembered it, told me it was technically still open but cold, filed as a low priority because of missing fee person, because there'd never been physical evidence of foul play. That answer made me angrier than I expected it to. Sitting in that lobby with a folder full of manifests and phone records like they were nothing. What came next is the part that still sits wrong with me. I found out almost by accident, asking a friend of a friend, that the trooper who'd worked the original scene, the one who told me the thermos was still warm, the one whose report the whole department had been leaning on for 3 years, had left the force under a cloud not long after, over an unrelated matter involving falsified reports on routine traffic stops. That doesn't mean he lied about Denny's scene, but it meant I couldn't trust a single detail I'd been carrying around like gospel for 3 years, including the one detail that had haunted me the most. I filed a public records request for the original radio logs, just to see the raw timeline instead of the polished report, and found an 11-minute gap between when the trooper's written report said he arrived on scene and when the county radio log showed him actually calling it in. 11 minutes, which felt like an ugly little echo of those 11 looping seconds on the dash cam, though I know that might just be my mind wanting patterns where there aren't any. I found the man himself eventually, working security at a plant outside Midland, and he was defensive at first. The way anybody would be showing up on their porch asking about a call from years back. But he wore down some and admitted that county dispatch had gotten a call that morning, before any of this happened, from a woman who wouldn't give her name, warning that somebody was going to have trouble out past Monahan's that day. It got logged as a nuisance call and buried. Never connected to Denny until I found it myself digging through old records. Nobody had thought to cross-reference. That meant somebody had known, ahead of time, that something was going to happen on that stretch of road that day. Not just careful people covering their tracks after the fact. Actual foreknowledge. Through the same slow grapevine that had gotten me to the car wash and the ex-trooper, I heard about a woman who used to work the counter at a truck stop diner outside Monahan's, somebody who was said to hear things sitting behind that register that she wasn't supposed to hear, and who'd left town not too long after Denny disappeared. It took me over a month to find a working number for her. When I finally got her on the phone, she was guarded, but she confirmed she remembered Denny, remembered him arguing on the payphone outside a few weeks before he vanished, saying he wanted out, that he hadn't signed up to carry what he was carrying, scared of somebody he only ever called the yard man. She told me one more thing before she hung up, something she said Denny had asked her once, half joking, half not. Not that If anything ever happened to him, she should make sure his wife got a box out of his locker at the yard. Nobody had ever gone looking for that box, because nobody but her had ever known to ask. I drove out to that yard on a Saturday, when I knew the regular crew would be light, and talked a young hand into letting me check a locker that had technically still been company property, never cleared out, because nobody missing wanted the job of packing up a missing man's things. There wasn't anything dramatic in it. Just a folded, water-stained photocopy of a manifest, numbers crossed out in pen and rewritten by hand, next to another set of numbers that didn't match anything on the official paperwork. Denny had been keeping his own private tally, quietly, comparing what he was told. He was hauling against what showed up somewhere else on the books. That was the moment it stopped feeling like a mystery about a man who vanished and started feeling like the record of a man who'd been building a case slowly on his own, he'd own, probably planning to hand it to somebody who could do something with it. Or maybe just trying to make sure that if something happened to him, it wouldn't happen for nothing. I sat with that folded piece of paper for longer than I want to admit, because I understood I was holding something that had already gotten one man disappeared, and I didn't especially want to find out what it could do to a dispatcher with two kids of her own at home. I thought about handing it straight back to the sheriff's department and decided against it, given how carelessly that office had already handled ours. The file once. Instead, I went to a highway patrol officer I'd worked with for years, somebody I actually trusted, who had contacts on an interstate drug task force, since anything moving through hollow drill pipe wasn't staying inside one county's jurisdiction anyway. I gave him copies of everything: the manifest, the phone records, the names, the dates, and let it become somebody else's fight. I won't pretend that turned into the kind of ending you get on the news, cuffs, and a press conference, and a name cleared. It didn't. What it turned into, months later, was a quiet reclassification, the file moving from missing person to person of interest in an ongoing federal investigation, which sounds like a small thing on paper and felt like the ground shifting under me when I heard it. It meant Denny might not have been a man. Something simply happened to. He might have been the reason. Something started happening to somebody else. I still see his wife at that HEB sometimes, and there's a different kind of quiet between us now, one that isn't just grief anymore, because I've never told her everything I found, and I'm not sure I ever will. Not until there's something solid enough to hand her instead of a folder full of maybes. I still watch that stretch of highway on the tracking map whenever a truck's running behind, out that way, and I still hold my breath until I see the dot start moving again. But it's a different kind of breath holding now than it used to be. Underneath the fear, there's something I'm almost ashamed to admit I feel. A small, stubborn thread of hope that wherever Denny ended up, he got out clean. That the box and the manifest and the warning call 3 years too late did exactly what he needed them to do, and that somewhere out past Monaghan's, past the sandhills and the pump jacks nodding along the horizon, a man who never wanted to be a hero is still alive to know somebody finally started asking the right questions.